You think living in a castle was magical? Try sleeping in a stone freezer wrapped in wet wool with rats in the toilet and frostbite on your toes. Welcome to medieval misery, royally cold and wildly overrated. Think your rent is high? At least it doesn't come with frostbite rats and a bucket for a toilet. Let's be real. Everyone's childhood dream of living in a castle was based entirely on animated lies. Castles weren't cosy stone mansions filled with tapestries, roaring fires and mysterious romantic candlelight. They were damp, freezing fortresses designed to keep enemies out and human comfort very, very out of reach. Disney forgot to mention the mildew. First, let's murder the myth right here. And now castles were not designed for living. They were designed for surviving. Think of it as a beautiful coffin made of rock strategically placed on a windy hill to maximize your suffering and your chances of being stabbed. Every feature we associate with castle charm, the high towers, the grand halls, the echoing corridors, served a military function. That echo, not ambiance. Just acoustics perfect for hearing a sword clang when your neighbour gets murdered. Romantic. Now before you start quoting, but they had tapestries, yes they did. And you know why? Because the walls were so cold that if you leaned against them for longer than 2 minutes, your soul might leave your body. Tapestries weren't decoration. They were early medieval thermal insulation with a side of questionable embroidery. Picture your grandma's quilt, but with more battle scenes and blood. Still cold. And let's talk about those stone walls. Solid, yes. Imposing, sure. But temperature regulating, absolutely not. Stone doesn't just fail to hold heat, it actively laughs at your suffering while sucking every drop of warmth out of the room like a sociopathic sponge. During winter, you weren't just cold. You became an unpaid extra in a medieval horror film called the Ice Age Home Edition, starring your numb feet. If you imagine lords and ladies sipping wine by the fire while gentle snow falls outside, that's adorable. The truth. That fireplace was usually a sad little rectangle of open flame-burning wood, like it owed someone money while the rest of the room remained a meat locker. Heat didn't circulate. It rose straight up to the rafters because medieval science forgot the concept of heat distribution. So unless you were a bat hanging from the ceiling, you froze in style. Now let's address the soundscape of your dream castle. Modern homes hum with heaters. Castles creaked, moaned and whispered like haunted prisons auditioning for a horror film. The wind didn't gently blow through, it howled. Constantly. Like a banshee who stubbed her toe and decided to move in rent-free. People didn't whisper because they were polite. They whispered because they didn't want the wind to think they were alive, still holding on to the fantasy. Okay, here's the charming detail nobody asked for. Castle floors weren't just cold, they were often damp, and when I say damp I mean medieval sock left in a bog level of moisture. That stone absorbed every drop of humidity from the air and said you'll be walking barefoot over mould for the rest of your life. Rugs existed, sure, but only if you were rich enough to own 10 sheep, and heartless enough to shear them in December. And those famous great halls, big, majestic, echoey, and cold enough to kill your will to live. They were designed to hold hundreds of people and a few torches. Guess what happens when you pack 200 peasants into a stone barn in winter? They don't get warmer. They just collectively freeze, sneeze, and share the plague. Think of it as a group hug, but with pneumonia. Oh, and let's not forget the doors. Thick oak monstrosities that barely close properly, because precision carpentry wasn't exactly the Middle Ages' strong suit. Gaps and cracks let the cold in, and kept the warmth somewhere in France. Ever tried to heat a room when there's a 1-inch gap under the door? Now imagine doing it with no electricity, 1 log, and a prayer to St. Toasty. But surely you asked, didn't they adapt? Yes, by freezing slowly in layers. They didn't complain because they had no concept of central heating to compare it to. Misery was simply the standard operating system. You weren't cold, you were alive, and that was good enough. In medieval terms, if your toes still tingled, you were winning. So the next time you get nostalgic watching a fairy tale princess glide down a grand staircase in a satin gown, remember she would have caught hypothermia halfway down, and then had to poop in a wooden box over a pit. Castles weren't magical. They were fortresses of frost and feces built to survive sieges, not selfies. But hey, maybe that's the point. Castles weren't meant to make you feel warm. They were meant to remind you that life was cold short and probably full of rats. Want to feel like royalty? Wrap yourself in 7 blankets, turn off the heat and scream into the void. Let's get one thing straight. Medieval stone wasn't your friend. It didn't hug you back, it didn't store warmth, and it certainly didn't care that your nose turned blue while you slept. Modern people romanticize castles like they were majestic homes of the nobility. But those thick stone walls, they weren't for comfort. They were for defence, and as a side effect, they trapped you in an eternal icebox shaped like architectural hubris. You see, stone is fantastic if your main priority is not dying from flaming arrows. But if you'd like your house to not feel like a meat locker in January, stone is the equivalent of installing regret as your interior design theme. The walls didn't just get cold, they stayed cold. In fact, they became cold. Touch one and it felt like making out with a glacier. And the worst part, stone doesn't just keep the cold in, it radiates it like a passive-aggressive roommate. Heat a room all day with a fire and you'd feel some warmth until you walked past the wall. It was like standing next to an emotional vampire slowly sucking the joy from your bones. You could sit near the hearth and roast one side of your body while the other side slowly froze solid. Congratulations, you are now a human rotisserie. But let's not forget the best part, condensation. Moisture gathered on the inside walls because air circulation in castles was about as advanced as potato. Every breath, every wet boot, every steamy bowl of gruel added to the humidity. That moisture. It stuck to the stone. Then it froze. And now congratulations, you were living inside a medieval freezer that also happened to host dinner parties and occasional sieges. Speaking of parties, imagine trying to entertain guests in this environment. You invite the local lord over for a feast, and he's sitting there trying to look noble, while discreetly losing circulation in his knees. Nobody could concentrate on conversation, because everyone was too focused on pretending they weren't slowly dying of cold. And when someone stood too close to the wall, cue the polite scream as their cloak froze to the masonry. And just in case you're wondering, no, they didn't have rugs everywhere. Most floors were stone with maybe a sprinkle of straw or rushes for flavour. Straw that, by the way, trapped moisture, attracted bugs and never got cleaned properly. So not only were you cold, you were damp and itchy. Welcome to medieval multisensory suffering. Even fireplaces couldn't save you. Sure, there were hearths built into some walls, but they were small, inefficient, and only present in the nice rooms. Heat from the fire didn't spread evenly, because the stone walls acted like passive-aggressive heat thieves. And guess what? Chimneys weren't common until the late Middle Ages, so smoke just kinda lingered. You got cold and smoked like bacon. 5-star living. Some clever folks tried to outsmart the stone. They'd hang tapestries, install wooden panelling, maybe build smaller rooms inside larger rooms to trap heat. But let's be honest, it was like putting mittens on a snowman and hoping it turns into a sauna. Wood rotted, fabric collected mould, and the stone still sat there smugly doing its best impersonation of an iceberg with property taxes. Now don't get it twisted, people did try to get warm. They layered up like medieval onions, tunics, cloaks, fur wool, another cloak and maybe a third tunic for emotional support. But clothes can only do so much when the walls themselves are plotting your hypothermia. And if you were poor, forget layers. You wore what you had even if it had more holes than fabric. Cold didn't discriminate, but it definitely bullied the peasants harder. Sleeping was another icebound adventure. Beds were pushed away from exterior walls if you were smart. If not, you spent the night spooning a wall that actively hated you. Some beds had curtains, not for privacy, but to trap body heat like a desperate cocoon. People even slept with dogs, not because they loved animals, because the alternative was death by draught. And speaking of drafts, those were everywhere. Medieval builders left little love notes in the form of unsealed joints, door gaps and window holes big enough to rent to passing birds. Every cosy stone room was a wind tunnel in disguise. The castle wasn't just poorly insulated, it was proudly uninsulated like some cold Gothic statement piece against comfort. Oh, and let's not ignore the fact that cold didn't just annoy you, it could kill you. Infections, hypothermia, respiratory disease. These were frequent flyers in castle life. The combination of damp stone, no heat circulation and freezing winds meant lungs stayed wet, feet stayed numb and immune system stayed overworked. You didn't catch colds. You caught entire medieval pandemics delivered to your doorstep by the very rocks you lived in. But hey, at least the stone walls were beautiful, right? Thick grey slabs covered in moss history and the smell of centuries-old misery. They were built to last, and they did. Long enough to outlive every single person who ever cursed their frigid embrace. In many ways, the stone won. It stayed strong. Everyone else turned to dust or icicles. Still fantasizing about your castle lifestyle, good. Now picture this, it's midnight, your candle burned out, the fire is long dead, and you can see your breath from bed. You press your hand against the wall, it bites back. Somewhere in the corner, a rat sneezes. This is not a fairy tale, this is your home now. So the next time someone tells you they want a castle-style house, ask them how they feel about frostbite in the hallway, mildew in the kitchen, and the sweet scent of damp despair in every room. Because if you want to feel what it was really like, all you need is a stone basement, zero insulation, and a few angry ghosts whispering in Latin. Stone doesn't care, it never did. That's the lesson. You thought you were building a monument to glory, but really you were constructing a giant stone apology letter to everyone who'd ever have to live in it. A cold one, etched in frost. Let's talk about fireplaces, the medieval equivalent of lighting a match in a hurricane and hoping for central heating. Fireplaces were supposed to be your one saving grace in a freezing stone hellhole right wrong. They were tiny, inefficient, smoke-belching pits of despair that mocked your every attempt at feeling human. If you've ever roasted a marshmallow over a single tea candle, congratulations, you already understand medieval heating. First of all, the size. You're probably imagining those massive hearths in films big enough to cook a boar and warm an army. That's cute. Most fireplaces in castles weren't majestic or even moderately effective. They were shallow cavities in walls that coughed out more smoke than heat, like a chain-smoking chipmunk pretending to be a furnace. The flame was small because firewood was expensive and deforestation was already a thing by the 13th century. And even if you could afford more firewood, the design of the fireplace actively hated you. Early fireplaces lacked proper chimneys, so smoke just drifted into the room and tried to choke everyone out. Picture a dinner party where everyone's eyes are watering not from laughter, but from carbon poisoning. People didn't sit by the fire to relax. They sat by the fire to survive and occasionally wheezed out a story between coughs. Medieval chimneys, when they finally appeared, weren't exactly engineered with modern airflow dynamics in mind. Drafts pulled heat straight up and out because the chimney's main job wasn't to warm the room, it was to make sure the fire didn't asphyxiate you too quickly. The result, you sat in front of the fire like a desperate moth toasting your knees, while the rest of your body filed a formal complaint to God. But perhaps the cruelest joke was this: most people didn't even get a fireplace. Only the Lord's chamber and the Great Hall were likely to have one. Servants, guards, everyone else. They got ambient chill as their only atmospheric option. Your room was heated by sheer proximity to the fire if you were lucky. If not, you got warmth from shared body heat and shared misery. Like a medieval cuddle pile minus consent and comfort. And guess what? Fires went out. Shocking, right? At night, you couldn't just leave it burning unless you wanted to roll the dice on castle-wide combustion. So when the last ember died, so did your hope. Waking up at 3 a.m. because your nose froze shut wasn't rare. It was basically the medieval version of a morning alarm. Speaking of hope, let's talk firewood. It sounds simple: cut down tree, make fire be warm. Not exactly. Firewood had to be seasoned, stored and transported. You couldn't just grab a wet log and toss it in. You had to plan. You had to ration. You had to fight other freezing people for the good stuff. And most importantly, you had to avoid dying of splinters and back strain before you even got it home. Then there was the sheer effort. Starting a fire wasn't just striking a match and walking away like a pyromaniac in a movie. It took flint skill, patience, and roughly 12 kinds of swearing. Wet wood, no fire. Drafty room, no fire. Too much smoke. Guess what? You've just turned your living space into a barbecue pit without the meat. And without the joy. Even when everything went right, fires only heated what was directly in front of them. The heat didn't radiate like a modern space heater. It gently oozed out and got eaten alive by cold stone, leaky windows and ungrateful air. Sit 1 foot too far from the fire and you might as well be outside. Sit too close and congratulations, you've just singed your eyebrows and melted your only pair of woolen socks. In theory, fireplaces were meant to warm the room. In reality, they served as psychological support. You thought you were warmer, so you convinced your body to stop trembling for 5 minutes. It was medieval placebo therapy, powered by glowing embers and desperation. The fire didn't warm your bones, it warmed your illusions. Barely. Now imagine this setup in winter. Days are short, nights are endless, and everything outside is either frozen or trying to kill you. You drag yourself into the hall after hours of bone-chilling labour, stare at the single pathetic flame, and wonder how this counts as civilization. It's not just cold, it's a personal attack by nature masonry and bad interior design. Still dreaming of cosy castle life. Let's add one more log to the fire of disillusionment. Fireplaces didn't smell like pine and cinnamon. They smelled like smoke rot and disappointment. There were no scented candles to mask it. Just the perfume of burning furniture, scraps, damp kindling, and possibly a dead bird that got stuck in the chimney 3 weeks ago. If you ever visit a real medieval hearth, bring a gas mask and a time machine to escape. And if you were noble with access to multiple fireplaces, lucky you, now you've got to be slightly less miserable in more rooms. Still cold, still smoky. But now with a bigger wardrobe to hang near the fire and hope it didn't catch. Nobility didn't buy you warmth. It just gave you the illusion of options, like dying of cold in velvet instead of burlap. By the way, castle fireplaces were notoriously hard to cook in. Sure, there was a kitchen, but in many early castles, the main hearth doubled as the cooking space. So now you've got your only heat source, also producing stew smells, boiling over and hosting grease fires. It was less hearth and home and more hazard and heartburn. And let's not forget, fire was dangerous. In a world where everything was either stone or flammable fabric, fire wasn't just a cosy element. It was a constant risk of death. One bad spark and half the hall could go up in flames. No fire department, no extinguisher. Just a lot of screaming and a strong regret about storing dry hay near the drapes. Still think fireplaces were quaint good. Let's summarise. A medieval fireplace was a smoky, temperamental, tiny excuse for a heater that could poison you, blind you, burn you, or betray you at any moment. It took hours to start, minutes to die, and seconds to disappoint. And yet people loved them. Because the alternative was sitting in silence in the dark, slowly becoming one with the frost-covered floor. So next time you're curled up by your modern gas fireplace with a hot drink, soft socks and central heating humming in the background, give a little nod to the past. Not in admiration, but in pity. Because back in the day, staying warm required strategy, sacrifice, and an acceptance of constant creeping cold. Fireplaces didn't save people. They gave them just enough hope to survive the rest of the suffering. Let's talk about the real monarchs of medieval castles, not kings, not queens, not even rats. I'm talking about the drafts. Those invisible, icy intruders that moved freely through every corridor, chamber and chapel, like they paid taxes. You couldn't stop them, couldn't reason with them, and certainly couldn't escape them. If there were passports in the Middle Ages, drafts would have had dual citizenship in every room. They weren't visitors, they were residents. Forget ghosts. The real haunting in castles came from the wind. It didn't knock politely at the door, it burst in uninvited and screamed across your skin like an angry banshee with boundary issues. Every crack, crevice, and poorly fitted wooden frame was an open invitation to the elements. And medieval builders weren't exactly known for their airtight sealant skills. You lived in a giant glorified stone colander, only less useful. You ever feel that subtle chill in a room and think, is there a window open? Now imagine that feeling turned up to 11 constantly with zero hope of improvement. That was castle life. Doors that didn't fit their frames, windows that were basically aesthetic holes, roofs that leaked more emotion than a heartbroken poet. And no one thought to say, maybe let's fix the wind problem. Because wind was the design. You could try hanging a tapestry, maybe stuff a cloth in the door gap, perhaps even pray. But drafts weren't interested in your human tricks. They slipped through the tiniest holes, wrapped themselves around your ankles, and crept up your spine like cold little gremlins with a grudge. They didn't just cool the room, they patrolled it, guarding every stairwell like the castle's own privatised militia. And let's be clear, drafts didn't care about your status. Peasant knight lady king, if you had a room, you had a wind problem. The throne room wasn't exempt. You could be issuing royal decrees 1 minute and shivering like a wet cat the next. Wearing ermine fur wasn't a fashion choice, it was wind armour, and even then the wind still won. Every single time. In the great halls, drafts came down chimneys through floor gaps and between roof beams with the confidence of someone who knew they weren't being evicted. They swirled during banquets, danced during ceremonies, and whispered over your shoulder when you tried to sleep. Forget ambiance. You weren't hearing medieval whispers of intrigue, you were hearing air currents mock your mortality. Bedrooms weren't safe either. The worst part, night drafts. These were the sneaky ones. You'd seal your shutters pile on the fur's nest into your hay-stuffed mattress, and then whoosh, something cold and invisible would crawl under your blanket like a ghost with commitment issues. You'd flail, mutter curses and rap tighter. But the wind always got in. Why didn't they fix it, you ask? Because fixing required tools knowledge and the radical belief that comfort was worth pursuing. Castles were built to withstand sieges, not breeze invasions. So if a few drafts slipped in and turned your bed into a tundra, that was just part of the lifestyle. Like feudal taxes or boils, you didn't complain. You just layered up and died a little inside. Architecturally, castles had features that actively encouraged drafts. Arched ceilings and spiral staircases created wind tunnels. Open hallways and narrow slits for windows turned every corridor into a medieval windsurfing track. Want to go from the kitchen to your room. Congratulations, you just took a stroll through the Ice Age, with dinner in hand, if it wasn't frozen by the time you arrived. And then there were murder holes. Sounds dramatic, and they were. These were gaps in ceilings used to pour hot oil or rocks on attackers. Very effective in a siege. Less effective in keeping your living room above freezing. Wind didn't care about your tactical brilliance. It used your murder holes as personal air slides. Nature's Revenge medieval edition. Let's talk clothing. People wore so many layers not to be fashionable, but to survive the constant assault of ambient weather conditions inside their own home. You weren't dressing for the day. You were dressing for war against your house. Wool, linen, fur, each layer a desperate act of defiance against air currents that had zero chill literally and emotionally. And if you didn't layer right, you didn't sleep. You shivered theatrically until sunrise. The most tragic part, people got used to it. Kids grew up chasing each other through hallways while sniffling, coughing, and occasionally turning purple. Adults just accepted that winter came inside. Your own room could betray you. The castle was a wind tunnel with furniture. And comfort was something that existed only in stories, told by people who hadn't frozen to the bench yet. Even heating a room didn't defeat the drafts. You'd light a fire, feel momentary relief, and then watch in horror as a gust of wind swept across the floor and stole the warmth like a mugger with wings. Heat disappeared faster than your will to live. You could spend hours collecting wood, starting a fire, and guarding it like your firstborn, only for one gust to undo it all in 30 seconds. Ever try closing a medieval door in a windstorm? It's like arguing with a cat, loud, ineffective, and humiliating. The wind had no respect for hinges. Doors slammed open, shutters banged like ghosts auditioning for a horror film, and anything not nailed down was now airborne. Castles weren't buildings. They were weather experiments with plumbing made of buckets. And let's not forget the noise. Drafts didn't just freeze you, they announced themselves. Constant howling, moaning, rattling. Sleep was accompanied by the soundtrack of a possessed cave. Romance impossible, intimacy laughable. Nothing kills the mood like a gust of Arctic wind crawling up your leg mid-conversation. Some castles tried to mitigate drafts with wooden panelling or inner rooms, but those were for the rich. The rest of the castle remained an echo chamber for angry wind. Even monasteries built with contemplation in mind had corridors that whistled like dying flutes. Inner peace was hard to find when the air itself kept slapping your face. In a poetic way, drafts were the castle's way of reminding you that you didn't really belong. You were a temporary guest in a building designed for war, not warmth. You came with hopes of nobility and grandeur, and left with frostbite and a permanent chill in your soul. That wasn't a castle, that was a glorified windsock. So next time if someone tells you they want to buy a castle because it's romantic, just ask them how romantic it sounds to live in a place where the wind deserves its own bedroom and voting rights. Because in a real medieval castle, drafts didn't come and go. They moved in, and they brought friends. Let's have an honest conversation about medieval windows, the architectural equivalent of opening your mouth in a snowstorm and calling it breathing. Windows today mean natural light, pretty views, Instagram-worthy curtains. Back then, windows were luxury holes in your fortress that let in wind, rain, birds, disease, and occasional arrows. Basically, they were the medieval version of saying, hey, misery, come on in. First of all, if you had windows at all, you were already suspiciously wealthy or dangerously optimistic. Most peasants and even many lower-tier nobles just had wooden shutters, or if you were really broke, animal skins stretched over a frame. That's right. Your castle view a semi-translucent piece of dried cow. It didn't just smell weird, it filtered the light like a haunted nightlight. Romance was dead, and don't go thinking these shutters sealed anything. They barely latched. Wind blew right through the cracks, rain seeped in at dramatic angles, and insects treated them like revolving doors. If you had a particularly stormy night, you didn't just hear the rain. You felt it in a fine mist sprayed lovingly over your bed by the gaping architectural wound you called a window. Surprise. It's raining inside again. But what about glass? Oh, you sweet summer child. Glass was rare, precious, and ridiculously expensive. If you had real glass in your window before the 14th century, you were either royalty or had personally blackmailed a bishop. And even then the glass was wavy uneven, and as clear as beer poured through a mud puddle. You could see the light coming in, but not much else. Privacy and aesthetic, nope. Just blurred silhouettes and the crushing realization that your glass cost more than your kitchen staff's collective lifespan. Even worse, glass didn't keep the cold out. Not really. It helped slightly more than a hole, which is saying almost nothing. And since it was so precious, it was installed in small, fragile panes, framed in lead, meaning it broke easily, let drafts in around the edges, and had to be repaired constantly by someone who hated their job. Soundproofing, forget it. You could still hear every howl of wind and every neighbour coughing like they were dying, because they probably were. Now let's dive into the medieval engineering marvel known as the arrow slit. These narrow vertical windows looked cool, sure. They gave you that defend the castle while brooding aesthetic. But they weren't for admiring sunsets or daydreaming about love, they were for shooting people. That was the only kind of natural light most soldiers got, a single vertical strip of grey sky, filtered through several inches of freezing stone and mortal dread. If you had a larger window, it often lacked glass completely and relied solely on wooden shutters to close it. In summer, this was great for light and air circulation, right before it turned into a bug buffet with you as the main course. In winter, opening the shutter was like flipping on the Arctic fan. You could watch your breath crystallize mid-air while birds considered moving in. Ever try to read or sew in that no good? Because they did. And it was awful. Still not convinced. Let's talk about security. Windows were weaknesses. Every hole in your castle wall was a chance for someone to shoot through it, climb through it, or throw something disturbing through it. There are historical records of invaders flinging plague-ridden corpses through castle windows as part of early biological warfare. Take that pottery barn. People who lived in castles eventually figured this out and tried to add iron bars or lattice work. But that just made them darker, colder, and somehow less cozy, like being trapped inside a giant medieval hamster cage. The view wasn't terrible, the wind remained savage, and now you got to enjoy the elegant silhouette of rust in your breakfast nook. Stunning! Even the best windows, like those in great halls or chapels, weren't built for comfort. They were status symbols. "Look at my big window," said the Lord. "Now look at my shivering guest sitting 15 feet below it." These large openings brought in a little more light, sure, but they also became perfect air funnels. Warm air went up. Cold air came in, and every draught threw a party around your ankles while you tried to eat your boiled turnip stew with dignity. Curtains, you ask? Yes, eventually. But they weren't cute drapes from a catalogue. Early medieval curtains were heavy, stiff, and made of materials you wouldn't want near your face. Think thick wool or rough linen, often reused from beds or cloaks stained with whatever horrors the last plague had to offer. They didn't flow gracefully in the breeze, they flapped like the wings of a death angel. And cleaning these window areas? Not a thing. Dust, mould, dead bugs, occasional bird droppings, it all accumulated in the sills and frames like nature's scrapbook. Servants had bigger concerns than wiping the window ledge of a noble's third chamber, like staying alive, or hauling buckets of water up spiral stairs for someone's once-a-month lukewarm bath. But maybe the most depressing thing about medieval windows is how little they actually illuminated. The walls were thick, often several feet deep. Light had to travel through all that stone to reach your damp, sad little chamber. So even in daylight, most rooms looked like a candlelit cave with tax paperwork. If you didn't have a fire, a candle, or a spiritual epiphany, you were basically living in darkness, still dreaming of that castle life. Let's roleplay. You're standing in your freezing bedroom staring at your shuttered window. It's leaking rain, moaning with wind, and the glass, if it exists, is fogged over like a drunk ghost's eye. You open the shutter for air, and a bird immediately poops on your bed. You close it again and sit back down, slightly damp, questioning your ancestry and all of your choices. Modern windows give you warmth, silence, light, and safety. Medieval windows gave you pneumonia, emotional trauma, and a sense of foreboding every time they creaked. They weren't accessories, they were liabilities. Holes that let in weather, wildlife, disease, and despair. And if you were lucky, maybe a little light. But not enough to read the warning signs carved into the drafty stone walls. So the next time you hear someone say, "I wish I lived in a castle with those gorgeous old windows," smile politely, and then ask them how they feel about frostbite with a view. Because in the medieval world, windows didn't brighten your life. They ruined it, decoratively. Let's set the record straight. Medieval beds were not the comfy, fluffy havens modern mattresses have spoiled us with. They weren't where you sprawled out with a cup of tea and watched your favourite show. No, in a castle, a bed was the place you went to contemplate your mortality and pray that your soul didn't freeze to death before your body. Forget memory foam. Think damp straw, itchy wool, and a persistent draught that whispered good night in the tone of a death threat. Now, if you were among the lucky nobles, you got a 4-poster bed. And sure, that sounds fancy until you realise that the 4 posts were not for decoration, but for function. Those curtains weren't romantic. They were medieval insulation. You slept inside what was basically a human-sized heat trap. Because when your room is made of solid stone and the walls sweat ice, you don't crave luxury, you crave containment. Even then, the bed itself wasn't much better. The mattress was typically a sack filled with hay feathers if you had money or straw if you didn't. And you didn't get to flip it when it got uncomfortable because there was no such thing as even distribution. One side always slumped, one side always itched, and sometimes there were bugs. Not the metaphorical kind, actual wriggling, biting bugs. Because why settle for cold when you can have cold and crawling discomfort? Let's not forget about the sheets. Linen, if you had any, was rare and precious. Wool was more common, and by more common I mean rough, itchy and prone to harbouring everything from lice to despair. You didn't change your sheets often because that meant laundry. And laundry meant hauling water from the well, heating it over a fire, scrubbing by hand, and possibly dying of exhaustion halfway through. So you slept in your own filth, but fashionably with a high thread count of regret. Pillows maybe, but again only if you were rich or resourceful. Most people use rolled up clothes, bundles of straw, or the comforting lump of whatever they hadn't finished sewing yet, and forget ergonomics, your neck pain was just another medieval rite of passage, along with hunger, frostbite and emotional repression. You didn't sleep comfortably. You survived the night like it was an unpaid internship in misery. The location of the bed also mattered. Was it next to a wall? Congrats, now your spine will crystallise during the night thanks to direct contact with the freezing stone. Was it in the middle of the room? Great, now you're exposed to drafts from every direction. Sleeping in a castle was less like dozing off in luxury and more like setting up camp in a refrigerated cave full of ghosts and structural regrets. And then there was the actual act of sleeping. You didn't stretch out, there wasn't room. Most people slept curled up to conserve body heat, wrapped in as many layers as possible occasionally, under a fur cloak or with a dog. Yes, a dog. Because medieval man's best friend wasn't just for company, it was for thermoregulation. And if you didn't have a dog, a child would do, or a spouse, or both. Because in the hierarchy of warmth, love came after survival. Oh, and here's a fun detail, people sometimes slept in shifts. That's right. One group would warm up the bed, and when their internal temperatures reached not dead, they'd swap with someone else. Because in the grand game of medieval life, heat was communal and fleeting. This wasn't a bed. It was a rotating misery station, like bunk beds in purgatory. If you lived in a colder region, or say anywhere in Europe, your sleeping hours were dictated by how many blankets you could steal or pile on. Quilts were stitched together like patchwork desperation. Fur ideal. But fur meant dead animals, and not everyone had access to fresh carcasses. So you wrapped yourself in old cloaks, grain sacks, or that one piece of cloth your great-aunt used as a death shroud. It was warm, and sentimental. Then came the noises, rats scuttling across beams, wind howling through arrow slits, fireplaces crackling or worse dying. You didn't fall asleep. You passed out from exhaustion, praying the cold didn't creep into your chest and set up permanent residence. And if you woke up, well, hopefully your fingers still moved. If not, welcome to the long list of people who froze with a look of mild disappointment on their face. Bed sharing was also the norm. You didn't get your own mattress unless you were powerful or antisocial. Whole families would share one bed. Sometimes servants too. Think less slumber party and more frozen human lasagna. You layered people like meat and noodles. The person in the middle was warmest. The one on the edge often woke up with frostbite and a bad attitude. Privacy. Forget it. There were no doors, just curtains or the honour system. You could be mid-snore while someone walked through your room with a torch and a bucket of chamber pot slosh. If you were lucky, they didn't trip and land on you. If you were really lucky, they didn't spill. Because nothing wakes you up faster than the sensation of mystery liquid seeping through your third cloak. Let's not romanticize the canopy bed either. It wasn't designed to look grand. It was designed to keep things from falling on you, like dust, or rat droppings, or fragments of plaster from the ceiling above, that fancy velvet drapery. Yeah, that was your rat shield. You weren't a noble in slumber, you were a human burrito under a tarp of architectural damage control. Also bed bugs. Did we mention those because beds were crawling with them? And lice, and fleas, and things that didn't have names yet because medieval taxonomy was busy cataloguing saints and not parasites. You didn't sleep in a bed. You negotiated a temporary ceasefire with the insects. If you woke up with fewer bites than usual, it was considered a win. So let's paint the full picture. You're wrapped in 5 itchy woolen layers, sharing a sagging sack of straw with your cousin, your neighbour's kid, and a terrier named Harold. The wind is whistling through a crack in the wall. There's frost forming on your blanket. You can't move too much or the whole pile might collapse. And somewhere in the dark a rat is chewing rhythmically on something you hope wasn't food. Sounds cosy. Exactly. So next time you collapse onto your spring mattress with memory foam and whisper, "Ugh, not soft enough," just remember, your medieval ancestors would have fought a literal war for that bed, with swords, in pyjamas made of sackcloth, and they would have lost because medieval beds weren't for sleeping. They were for surviving the nightly onslaught of discomfort disease and the raw existential dread that only comes from realising your pillow might also be someone's dinner. Let's begin with the truth. Medieval tailors never admitted no one dressed to impress. People dressed to avoid death. That was the whole vibe. Fashion wasn't about trends, it was about strategic layering and praying your fingers didn't freeze off before lunch. If someone looked stylish in the 13th century, it was probably a tragic accident. Or they were dead and someone else had borrowed their clothes. Forget Vogue. Think burlap chic. Wool was the king of the closet, not because it looked good, but because it was one of the few materials that stood a chance against the wind tunnel. People called daily life. And even then it wasn't the soft, luxurious wool you find on modern scarves. No. Medieval wool was scratchy dense, and occasionally still smelled faintly of sheep and sorrow. You didn't wear it because it flattered your body, you wore it because the alternative was frostbite and shame. Most people wore the same thing every day, and by the same thing I mean the same actual thing, as in one tunic, one undertunic, if you were lucky maybe a cloak and that was your outfit for the foreseeable future. Laundry wasn't weekly, it was barely seasonal. Clothes were scrubbed only when they were on the verge of developing their own personality or sentience. And even then, someone had to haul buckets of water uphill to make it happen. Medieval leg day. Now layering was the real fashion statement. You layered until you couldn't bend your arms. Under tunic, surcoat, cloak. Wool on linen on more wool. You weren't dressing up, you were assembling your own personal insulation system. The result, everyone looked like they were auditioning for the role of It's Colder Than Hell, and my boots are filled with regret. And yes, boots were often just cloth wraps unless you were rich, so enjoy those wet feet, peasant. Women had it worse. Surprise fashion standards expected noble women to appear elegant even while freezing inside stone walls that actively hated them. That meant long trailing gowns, excellent for collecting mud ash and disease, and bodices that restricted breathing because nothing says survival like a garment that prevents oxygen flow. And if they wanted to go outside, add another 3 layers. And maybe a headdress that doubled as a medieval satellite dish. Speaking of accessories, gloves weren't decorative. They were finger preservers. Mittens were often just sewn sacks of wool, sometimes shared between siblings like sad winter relay batons. Scarves were necessary if you wanted your neck to remain on your body. And hoods weren't just for drama, they were for not getting literal icicles in your ears. Fashion wasn't expression. It was negotiation with the weather. Let's not forget undergarments. Or rather, let's. Because underwear as we know it was optional. Men had braids, basically ancient boxer shorts that tied at the waist, usually made of linen if you were rich and something rougher if you weren't. Women wore shifts, long, simple tunics that doubled as nightgowns undergarments, and probably emotional support blankets. If it got washed, it was a good year. If it didn't, well, layering was your deodorant. And shoes. Oh, dear reader, shoes were barely shoes. Most were made of leather so thin it could cry. Soles were stitched on like a suggestion, and waterproofing was a fantasy invented centuries later. If it rained, snowed, or even looked damp outside, your feet turned into wet, squelching heat sinks. Thick socks. If you had them, you wore them until they dissolved into foot ghosts. Most people didn't own multiple pairs of shoes. You had your everyday pair, And you're also everyday but slightly less holy pair. Children didn't get better treatment. They were bundled in smaller versions of adult clothing, often reused and restitched from their parents' wardrobes. There's nothing quite like being 6 years old, wearing your grandfather's old tunic tied at the waist with a piece of twine, and still being expected to haul water uphill. If your sleeves were too long, roll them up. Too short, enjoy the breeze, kid. And then there were the poor. Their fashion choices were even more limited, by which I mean non-existent. Clothes were patched and repatched, passed down until they disintegrated, and mostly existed to cover skin and shame. If you were cold, you added straw to your shoes, stole a dead animal's fur, or just accepted that you'd never feel your toes again. Medieval minimalism, but make it tragic. Now let's say you were noble and rich. Did that help? Barely. Sure, you had more clothes, better materials, and sometimes even fur-lined cloaks. But wealth doesn't insulate against physics. Your castle was still freezing, your draft still had ambitions, and your fashion still fought a losing war against the wind. You could wear 10 layers of velvet and still find yourself weeping beside the hearth, because your thighs had gone numb. But hey, you looked fabulous doing it. Also fur. Let's talk about fur. The more exotic the animal, the more prestigious the outfit. Ermine, squirrel, fox, you name it, they skinned it. But guess what fur rots? It smells. It attracts lice. And unless it was tanned properly, it could stiffen into a weird, crunchy corpse coat. Nothing says power and wealth like shuffling down the hallway wearing a raccoon-shaped sleeping bag that smells like death. Clothing laws. Yes, there were laws dictated who could wear what. Sumptuary laws ensured peasants didn't accidentally look too snazzy and cause a class panic. So if you tried to wear a nice colour like purple or crimson and you weren't noble, you could be fined. Or worse, publicly shamed for dressing above your station. Nothing like freezing and being policed by the fashion cops. Who needs self-expression when you have oppression in wool form? Maintenance. Good luck. Mending clothes was a full-time job. Sewing by candlelight in a freezing room using dull needles and hand-spun thread, while your fingers slowly turned to icicles. Washing clothes was worse. Rivers were cold. Soap was rare, and scrubbing too hard meant you risked wearing holes into the only outfit you owned. So instead of washing, people just aired things out, meaning hanging your tunic outside for a day and calling it a win. If it didn't smell like death, it was clean. Did clothes ever make anyone feel comfortable briefly? If you stood directly in front of a roaring fire wearing 6 layers, holding a mug of mulled wine, and no wind happened to blow your way, yes. For that single glorious moment you might have felt something approaching warmth. Then a draught crept in under your cloak, your cup emptied, and someone opened a door halfway across the castle. That's when you remembered comfort was an illusion. Layers were your only friend. So next time you complain about having nothing to wear, remember your medieval ancestors. They literally had nothing to wear, and even that nothing was cold, stiff, scratchy, and probably infested with something that buzzed. Your worst laundry day was their everyday existence. Your puffer jacket is their dream journal entry. You wear fashion. They wore survival. If you've ever complained about a public restroom, congratulations, you're soft. Because medieval toilets weren't just inconvenient, they were death traps with plumbing made of gravity and shame. Forget porcelain, forget privacy, forget not seeing your waist ever again. In a castle, answering nature's call was a full-contact sport where the biggest threat wasn't smell, it was survival. Let's begin with the term garderobe. Sounds fancy, right? Like a place to hang cloaks and display noble perfumes. Wrong. It was a polite word for hole in the wall, where everything you ate yesterday exits into the universe. Usually located on the outer wall of the castle, hanging dangerously above a moat or, worse, a stone chute that led directly down the side of the building. No flushing, no seat. Just a wooden plank with a strategically placed cutout and a breeze so cold it could castrate you. And oh, that breeze! It didn't gently waft, it roared. Garderobes were often positioned to use the prevailing wind to carry the smell away from the castle. But guess what? Wind doesn't follow rules. It swirled, it screamed, it shot back up the chute and smacked you in the face with the smell of last week's stew. Imagine sitting with your backside exposed to the elements' freezing air, attacking your unmentionables, and the added fear that a strong gust might unseat you entirely. Because yes, people fell. Guardropes were suspended over nothing but cold stone dirty moats or narrow pits that nobody wanted to clean. The wooden platform could rot, the hole could be slippery, and medieval construction didn't exactly come with OSHA compliance. One slip, one misstep, one poorly timed sneeze and you weren't just embarrassed, you were a tragic footnote in castle history. Sir Edmund died valiantly on the toilet wall, slipped on his own dignity. Let's also talk about the smell. People didn't have air fresheners, scented candles, or even the common decency to use a leaf afterward. There was no plumbing system, no running water. Waste just accumulated in cesspits, underfloor chambers, or right outside the castle wall. And guess who got to clean it? No one. Or rather some very unlucky soul with a bucket, a shovel, and an immune system made of iron despair. These cesspits weren't just gross, they were biohazards. Overflowing waste seeped into the ground, the walls, and sometimes the kitchens. That's right. Kitchens were often placed near guardraobes because warmth and human error never slept. Cross-contamination wasn't a possibility. It was a lifestyle. You could literally taste tragedy in your soup. And don't even think about toilet paper. It didn't exist. People used leaves, moss hay, their left hand, or the edge of their tunic if they were particularly dead inside. Softness wasn't part of the equation. The goal wasn't comfort, it was completion. And if you had a hemorrhoid, a splinter, or a questionable wart, tough luck. This wasn't healthcare. It was medieval roulette with every wipe. Let's not forget these toilets weren't private. There were no stalls, no locks, no occupied signs. A garderobe was a communal experience in misery. In some places, 2 holes were placed side by side so people could chat while evacuating. Because if you're going to shiver, stink, and fear for your life, you might as well do it next to someone you love. Or more likely, someone you hated and hoped would fall first. Also, the noise. There was no water to muffle the sound. Every drop, plop, splash, or tragic echo was amplified by the stone shaft below. Castles were acoustic marvels. You could hear someone use the toilet 3 floors up, and no one pretended otherwise. That was just background music. The medieval Spotify playlist fire crackle, draft whistle, human suffering, and the unmistakable echo of digestive honesty. Now you may be wondering, how did they build these things? Carefully, or not. Garderobes were constructed as small stone or wooden projections from the outer wall, like a weird little balcony for your bowels. Waste dropped straight down into the moat, which then turned into a lovely sewage river circling the castle. Why does the castle smell like death? Because it is death. Circulating around your home like a toxic friendship. Some castles added chutes and tunnels to channel waste away, but away just meant somewhere else nearby. Maybe into the courtyard, maybe into a nearby stream, maybe into your neighbour's moral compass. It didn't matter. There were no treatment plants, no sanitation engineers, just gravity and regret, and cleaning rare. Maybe once a year, maybe never. Sometimes they'd just brick over the old cesspit and dig a new one. Out of sight, out of mind, until the wall started weeping. And when they did clean it, it involved digging through layers of decomposing sludge while holding your breath and contemplating all the decisions that led you to this moment. A spiritual journey, one that often ended in vomiting and an early death. Noblemen sometimes had more refined garderobes with benches, covers, or even cushions. But let's be honest, stuffing a pillow onto a medieval toilet is like adding a doily to a dumpster fire. You can dress it up, but it still smells like despair. And even the fanciest toilet still emptied into the same filthy moat that doubled as your water source. Bon appétit. In some cases, garderobes were placed over high towers. While it helped the smell dissipate faster, it also meant that anything dropped from above could reach terminal velocity. Think bird droppings, but lethal. Imagine walking innocently through the courtyard and being struck by a gift from 3 stories up. You wouldn't just die, you'd become legend. And then there was the psychological cost. Imagine needing to go in the middle of the night. You light your tallow candle, wrap yourself in 4 layers of itchy fabric, and walk barefoot across a freezing stone floor. The wind is howling. You're half asleep. The guardrobe door creaks open like the gates of hell. You sit and immediately regret being alive. That was every day, every night. No plumbing, no warmth, just a hole, a breeze, and a faint prayer that you wouldn't lose a toe or worse, your entire sense of self. Toilets weren't a break. They were a battle. A medieval test of courage, hygiene, and hamstring control. So the next time you use a restroom with heated seats, automatic flush and ambient music, just pause, take a moment, and whisper thank you, history. Because back in the day, relieving yourself was a full-body horror film with no credits, no comfort, and absolutely no survivors. Let's begin with a simple truth in medieval castles. Bathing wasn't a regular hygiene practice, it was an act of lunacy. Taking your clothes off in a stone chamber where the wind has more freedom than the peasants, that wasn't brave. That was suicide by draft. People didn't avoid baths because they were dirty. They avoided them because standing naked in a freezing room while pouring cold water over yourself was like trying to kill a fever by jumping into a glacier. Modern folks complain when the water isn't just right. Meanwhile, your medieval ancestors were shivering naked in a tin bucket in a room, colder than betrayal, questioning why they were born. Heating water was an ordeal. First, you had to fetch it, likely uphill, likely in a blizzard, then heat it over a fire, then carry it without scalding yourself, all before it cooled back into disappointment. And this was assuming you had a fire, or help, or will to live. Let's say you were a rich noble, even. Did you get a fancy marble bath? Nope. You got a big wooden tub. That's it. If you were lucky, it was lined with cloth to keep your nether regions from encountering splinters. Not exactly spabday. You sat in lukewarm water that cooled rapidly because the room was a wind tunnel and your house was made of sadness. By the time you soaked for 5 minutes, your skin was covered in goosebumps and the regret of several generations. Servants might pour hot water in to top it off, but only if you were powerful or bribed them or hadn't yelled at them that week. Otherwise, you got a bucket over the head and a polite cough. Soap was rare and usually homemade. Think animal fat ashes and something vaguely herbal. Did it clean sometimes? Did it burn your eyes and leave a smell like haunted bacon? Absolutely. And if you thought this was a solo activity, think again. Families often shared bathwater, because heating a full tub's worth of water took hours and fuel was precious. It made sense to recycle it. Dad bathed first, then mum, then kids, then the baby. By the time you got in, it was less bath and more stew. You weren't cleansing. You were simmering in your relative's misery soup. Medieval broth. Public bathhouses existed in towns, but castles, not so much. A bathhouse in a fortress was rare and, if present, reserved for the elite. And let's not romanticize the public ones either. Sure, people got clean, but they also caught diseases, shared lice, and engaged in extracurricular activities that made the water more viscous than refreshing. Also, nudity was the norm. Imagine sweating it out next to your neighbour, his cousin, and the town drunk while everyone pretended it was fine. It wasn't. Still not deterred. Let's add wind. You're wet, naked, trying to scrub yourself with a rough linen. Suddenly a breeze slips through the window slit and slaps you like a frosty slapstick routine. There's no towel, just a rag, or your shift if you're desperate. Drying off meant standing near the fire if there was one and rotating slowly like a damp rotisserie chicken. Assuming, of course, the fire wasn't already taken by someone more important, more assertive or more angry. Bathing also made you vulnerable. Remember, this was a violent era. You didn't want to be caught pants down literally when a rival lord or roving band of mercenaries came knocking. Being clean wasn't worth being dead. People didn't bathe often because there was real risk in being naked and defenceless, especially in winter when armour doubled as a heater and security system. You weren't clean. You were strategically grimy. Some people tried dry bathing, scrubbing themselves with cloths or powders instead of water, which sounds elegant until you remember the powder was often flour or ground herbs, and the cloth was whatever wasn't being used as a bandage. The idea was to wipe away sweat dirt and emotional despair without risking hypothermia. Think of it as medieval dry shampoo, except for your entire body. With a 40% chance of ending in a rash, hair washing was an event. Long hair froze faster, stayed damp longer, and turned into a haystack of knots if not brushed daily. And guess what? Medieval brushes were made of boar bristles, wood, and prayers. Washing your hair meant wetting your head in freezing temperatures, massaging with a greasy lump of lard soap, and drying it with something resembling a potato sack. After which you hoped not to catch pneumonia, or lice, or both. Speaking of lice, everyone had them. Bathing didn't guarantee delousing. That required special Combs ointments, and occasionally setting your hat on fire just to be safe. You didn't shower to feel refreshed. You bathed to avoid being the smelliest corpse on the battlefield. Personal hygiene wasn't about self-love, it was about public tolerance. And don't think kids got it easier. Bathing a child meant screaming, splashing, and an eventual realization that the child was now dirtier than before. Getting a toddler to sit still in lukewarm, sheep-smelling water in a freezing room was like asking a chicken to do taxes. It didn't work. Most kids got wiped down occasionally and otherwise ran around in their filth like tiny shrieking bundles of bacteria and energy. Childhood was messy, and so was everything they touched. Let's not forget the religious angle. The church, bless their mouldy sandals, sometimes preached that too much bathing was sinful, that it led to vanity, or worse, lust. Because what could be more seductive than someone who just scraped 4 layers of grime off their armpits? Some monks went years without bathing as a spiritual challenge, which meant entire orders of holy men radiated the divine stench of unwashed piety. Truly inspiring. Eventually people got used to being dirty, your nose adjusted, your standards fell, and you focused on more important things like not starving, not freezing, and not dying in a latrine accident. Cleanliness might have been next to godliness, but in a castle it was more like next to impossible. So when someone did bathe, it was a thing, a celebration, a once-a-year act of bravery, courage, and temporary sanity. So next time you step into your steamy bathroom, adjust the water to a perfect 38 degrees Celsius, grab your exfoliating lavender body wash and sigh with pleasure. Remember this, your medieval ancestors would have wept at your luxury. Naked, in the snow, while holding a lumpy bar of soap and screaming at a goose that wandered into the tub. Because back in the day, bathing wasn't relaxation, it was warfare. Between man and wind, between soap and sanity, between nudity and survival, and most of the time survival won. Here's the cruel irony of medieval castle life. The only warm room in the entire fortress, the kitchen, was the one you, a mere mortal, were absolutely forbidden from entering. You'd think in a world dominated by frostbitten feet, drafty corridors and windows that doubled as wind tunnels, people would gather around the hearth like freezing moths to a blessed flame. But no, the kitchen was a sacred, chaotic zone reserved for cooks, firewood, boiling cauldrons, and things that could kill you faster than the cold. Heat existed, you just weren't allowed to have any. The kitchen in a medieval castle was less culinary arts centre and more flammable hellhole with knives. It was hot, loud, and constantly at risk of burning down the entire building. Fires were kept roaring all day to cook meals for hundreds of people using open hearths, iron pots, spits, and whatever could be shoved into the flames without causing mass food poisoning. The air was thick with smoke, the floors were slick with grease, and the ceilings were usually blackened from centuries of indoor soot. In short, it was the warmest, deadliest sauna in Europe, And because this was the only source of real heat, the temptation to sneak into the kitchen was real. Imagine being half frozen, your fingers stiff, your boots soggy, your soul whispering for mercy. And just down the hall is a room where fire lives, a room where warmth dances, meat sizzles, and there's the faint hope your toes might thaw. But no, you're not on kitchen duty. So back to your chamber you go to shiver under your 3 lice-infested cloaks and regret being born noble but not that noble. If you did manage to sneak into the kitchen, you risked a few things. 1, being beaten with a ladle by an angry cook. 2, being caught fined or shamed publicly for loitering in the service wing. And 3, slipping on a patch of spilled meat juice and cracking your head open next to the pig carcass. The medieval kitchen wasn't just a place of nourishment, it was a battlefield. An oven-lined war zone run by people who had knives, calloused hands, and very little patience for shivering intruders. The cooks themselves, saints and savages, depending on the day. They worked 12 to 16 hours, chopping, stirring, roasting and hauling massive pots across uneven stone floors. Their hands were burnt, their backs were bent, and they lived in a constant state of sweaty panic. Because if the Lord's food was late or worse bad, they were the ones who'd be blamed. That's a lot of pressure for someone preparing squirrel stew with a ladle that's also used to stir laundry water. The layout of the kitchen was intentionally cut off from the main castle. Not because people respected the kitchen staff, but because they feared them. Also, fire hazards. Fires were so frequent in medieval kitchens that some castles built the kitchen as a separate building entirely connected only by a hallway or breezeway. So if the roast duck caught fire and the whole kitchen went up in flames, it wouldn't take down the rest of the castle with it. Just a few unfortunate scullery boys and this week's wine delivery. Now let's talk food storage. Refrigeration. Castles used pantries, root cellars and larders. Cool rooms carved into the walls or floors where meat was stored until it was slightly less edible than disease. Preservation methods included salting, drying and hoping the mould added flavour. The kitchen was home to entire animal carcasses, piles of root vegetables that looked like medieval fists and baskets of grain that may or may not contain more weevils than wheat. This wasn't Gordon Ramsay. This was Iron Chef Plague Edition. And then there was the noise. Pots banging, spits turning, knives chopping, people shouting across the smoke-filled chaos like caffeinated gladiators. It was a symphony of culinary aggression. If you were lucky enough to pass nearby, you might catch a whiff of something edible, baked bread, sizzling pork fat or onion soup. But if you lingered too long, you'd be told off for breathing in someone else's workload. Kitchens weren't cosy. They were controlled firestorms. The warmth in a kitchen was both blessing and curse. Cooks often fainted from the heat. Fires flared unexpectedly, catching clothing or beards. Water boiled over grease-caught flame and smoke stung the eyes. People regularly died in kitchens, not from cuts or burns, but from inhaling too much soot or collapsing near a fire they couldn't escape. It was one of the few rooms in a castle where you could simultaneously overheat and suffer third-degree burns while still somehow being cold around the ankles. And don't think the food made it better. The lord and his family got the best cuts, the haunch of venison, the roast fowl, the spiced pies. Everyone else, you got the leftovers, the parts that were too gristly to serve upstairs. Porridge made from 3 grains and a prayer. Soups that were technically broth but mostly sadness. Bread that could double as a blunt weapon. The kitchen may have smelled delicious, but you rarely tasted what it cooked unless you stole it. And if you did, well, let's just say you'd get to know the other hot room in the castle, the blacksmith's forge, where hands and punishments got equally toasty. Want to eat in the kitchen? Don't even think about it. There were strict rules about where and when staff could eat. You might snatch a bite of crust while hunched over a barrel but sit down near the hearth. That was treason. The hearth was sacred. It warmed the food, not the cooks. Everyone else just shivered while standing, trying not to slip on boiling grease puddles. Now let's imagine you're a guest in the castle. You think maybe I'll visit the kitchen, warm up by the fire? No. The steward would look at you like you'd just suggested licking the Lord's boots. Nobility didn't enter kitchens. That was for servants. You stayed in your frigid chamber, gnawed on a cold mutton bone and fantasized about the heat you'd never be allowed near. The warmest place in the building might as well have been a dragon's lair. Eventually some castles had warming rooms, small chambers where nobles could wait while their food was being prepared. But these weren't hot. They were less cold. Maybe a brazier in the corner. Maybe a heated stone. Enough to make your fingers stop trembling for 5 minutes. That was luxury. You never got real heat. Just a teasing reminder that it existed elsewhere in a kitchen you'd never see unless you were born holding a ladle, or condemned to die near one. So next time you step into your modern kitchen barefoot warm, surrounded by blinking appliances and the soothing glow of an oven light, take a moment. Stare at your toaster, touch your refrigerator, whisper thank you to your thermostat. Because in the Middle Ages, kitchens weren't part of your living space. They were behind doors, past rules, patrolled by cooks with knives and tempers, and they were warm, yes, but only if you were willing to risk your dignity and your eyebrows. There's a particular kind of silence that only exists in a medieval castle at night, a silence so heavy it feels like the walls are holding their breath. But it's not peace, it's a trap. Because when the sun goes down and the fires die out, the castle transforms into a vast echoing refrigerator powered by regret. The cold doesn't gently arrive. It descends like a hungry predator, ready to remind you that no matter how many cloaks you're wearing, you're still mortal and made mostly of disappointment. During the day you could lie to yourself. You could pretend the drafts were just a light breeze. You could linger near a fire and imagine the stone walls had finally warmed up, even though they never did. But nighttime stripped away all illusions. The fires were reduced to dying embers, your breath became visible, and suddenly every surface in your room felt like it had been kissed by the icy lips of a corpse. Even your bones shivered. And you weren't alone in that misery. Everyone in the castle was collectively freezing and politely pretending it was fine. Let's paint the scene. You crawl into bed if you were lucky enough to have one and layer yourself like a sad human lasagna. Wool undergarments, tunic, another tunic, a cloak, a second cloak, maybe a dog, maybe a child, maybe both. You pull your scratchy woolen blanket over your chin, tug the thin curtains of your canopy bed shut, and try to ignore the fact that your toes have gone from cold to numb to missing. Somewhere out in the hallway, wind slithers through a gap under the door and strokes your ankle like a perverted ghost. Now this is assuming you had a bed. Servants often slept on the floor on pallets of straw, bundled up in whatever scraps of warmth they could find. No curtains, no mattress, just a body the floor and the chilling certainty that you were one sneeze away from becoming a historical statistic. And straw wasn't cosy, it was prickly, often damp and alive with tiny passengers. If the cold didn't get you, the lice would. If you didn't freeze, you'd scratch yourself into madness. Sleep wasn't rest, it was survival with your eyes closed. There was no getting up for a midnight snack either. If you needed something after sundown, you had to brave the castle corridors, vast echoing catacombs of darkness and regret. Lighting a candle, a luxury, finding your shoes, good luck. Most people just stayed put and hoped their bladder could wait until morning, because nothing made you question your life choices like tiptoeing barefoot through a wind tunnel, just to hover over a frozen hole in the floor while rats judged you. Let's talk about sound. Night in a castle wasn't truly silent. You'd hear the wind moaning through the arrow slits, the groaning of ancient beams settling, and the occasional skitter of something you hoped was a mouse and not a peasant ghost. The stone walls amplified every sound, your own breath, your partner's teeth, chattering the dog, snoring beside your face like a wheezing bagpipe. It was a symphony of medieval discomfort, and yet you'd cling to it, because absolute silence usually meant something had gone very wrong, and then there was fire or rather the lack of it. Fires weren't left burning through the night unless you wanted your castle to become the world's most tragic bonfire. So when the hearth cooled, so did your hope. You could try stuffing the embers, burying them in ash, or praying to St. Toasty, but by midnight the room was a stone freezer. Some people kept hot stones in their beds, warmed in the fire, wrapped in cloth and slipped between the sheets. But they cooled fast, sometimes cracked, and occasionally burned your feet while mocking your effort. The poor didn't even have a room, much less a fire. They slept in common halls near animals under shared blankets made from patched rags and quiet desperation. In winter, entire families would huddle together in the same bed, not for comfort, but for warmth. If you were on the edge, you lost. The centre of the pile was prime real estate, warm, safe, slightly less haunted by wind. But you couldn't move, because shifting might let the cold in, or worse, wake someone up and trigger a 2 a.m. round of passive-aggressive cloak tug-of-war. Some people didn't sleep at all. Night watchmen, guards, and unlucky servants stayed awake patrolling the corridors or stoking dying embers in the great hall. Wrapped in cloaks carrying dim lanterns, they paced between frozen walls and tried not to think about how much warmer it was outside, where at least you could run. Inside you were trapped, surrounded by stone shadow and centuries of architectural contempt. Did anyone complain? No, because everyone expected it. Cold was a fact of life, like death or poorly cooked stew. Children learned early to fall asleep before the cold fully set in. Adults learned not to cry because their tears might freeze, and the elderly simply accepted that winter nights were personal challenges issued by nature herself. If you woke up alive, it was a good night. If you didn't, well, less laundry to do. Let's not forget illness. Cold, damp environments were breeding grounds for respiratory issues, joint pain, and whatever vague medieval illness they hadn't named yet but always blamed on bad humours. People coughed constantly. Throats burned, limbs stiffened. But no one dared mention it unless they wanted to be bled by the nearest barber surgeon with a dirty knife and a winning smile. So you suffered quietly, surrounded by cold and phlegm, and the slow realization that modern medicine would have been pretty handy 700 years ago. Eventually your body gave up trying to sleep and just shut down out of spite. Dreams were rare, nightmares were common. Visions of warmth, of falling into fire, of waking up and finding your feet missing. The lucky ones learned to embrace the cold like an abusive friend. "Hello again," they whispered, wrapping their cloak tighter. "Let's do this." And the wind replied by whistling through the keyhole like a malevolent lullaby. So next time you wrap yourself in a duvet, adjust your heated blanket and sigh into your memory foam pillow, just pause. Think about the medieval noble lying awake on a wooden mattress filled with straw, whispering apologies to their own feet for freezing them again. Night wasn't restful. It was a gauntlet. A stone-cold challenge delivered every evening by a castle that didn't care if you ever saw morning. Because in medieval times, when the sun went down, the cold didn't knock. It let itself in, sat on your chest and whispered, "See you again tomorrow, sweetheart." There were coats of arms, there were family mottos, and then there was frostbite, an unspoken inherited badge of honour etched into the blue fingertips and blotchy cheeks of every soul unfortunate enough to survive a medieval winter. No embroidery required, just persistent exposure to misery and a body not quick enough to die. While noble families paraded golden lions and stoic griffins on their banners, the true symbol of heritage was a half-black toe and a thumb that tingled like betrayal. Frostbite didn't announce itself with fanfare. It crept in slow like a gossip with bad intentions. First it was numbness fingers stiffening as if they'd just remembered they weren't paid to be here. Then the stinging started like needles dancing through your skin, wearing shoes made of spite. Eventually you stopped feeling anything, which felt like a blessing, until someone pointed out your ear had turned grey and was about to drop off like a sad piece of jerky. By that point you were too cold to care. Medieval people didn't call it frostbite. They had other words, the rot death's nibble or simply the black. It wasn't treated, it was endured. If your toe turned black and fell off, you were lucky to still have a leg. If your ear shriveled and vanished during the night, well, at least now your helmet fit better. There were no salves, no heated clinics, no special socks, just prayer more wool, and the distant hope that you'd die of something else first. Even the nobility weren't safe. Having a fireplace didn't mean you had circulation. Those massive halls did little to stop the cold from crawling into your boots and whispering sweet nothings to your pinky toe. Nobles often sat for hours in freezing chambers, legs numb beneath layers of damp cloth pretending to enjoy their position, while their extremities plotted mutiny. Toes blackened beneath silk slippers, fingers stiffened around pewter goblets. Dignity clung on as long as possible until someone coughed and their nose just snapped. Children suffered worst of all. Their bodies still growing didn't know whether to fight or fold. Tiny fingers turned red, then pale, then blue. Their noses ran constantly, not from colds, but because the tip was surrendering to the air. Parents wrapped them in everything from sheepskin to damp fur to prayer, and still little hands emerged in spring-shaped like failed potatoes. Frostbite wasn't rare. It was routine, a seasonal ritual like planting or vomiting from old stew. Peasants learned to spot the signs early when warmth became memory and sensation became theory. They wrapped their limbs in strips of old cloth, stuffed straw into shoes, even tied warm bread to their skin, until the bread was eaten by rats or desperation. There were no boots with lining, no heated gloves, no central anything, just layers and luck. And yet somehow they survived. Not all of them, but enough to tell stories with only 3 fingers and a deep respect for wool. The church had no answers. Priests told people to pray harder, to accept suffering as purification, to give thanks for their remaining toes and offer their blackened ones to the Lord. Relics of saints included frostbitten hands kept in golden boxes. Martyrdom came in many forms, but none were as quietly pitiful as losing your ear to a winter breeze while walking to confession. You didn't go to church for healing. You went to die more respectfully. Castle guards suffered endlessly. Standing watch atop battlements meant becoming part statue. Wind howled like wolves' coats froze into armour and fingers fused around spear handles like tragic tree branches. They weren't protecting the castle. They were slowly becoming part of it. Changing shifts required the next guard to chip you free from the parapet like unwrapping a human icicle. Their reward: more wind, more pain, and maybe a coin if the steward remembered you existed. And for the lucky few who did survive frostbite, there was the aftermath. Scars shaped like Frost's autograph. Stiff joints that never bent quite right. Limbs that ached every winter. People didn't walk, they hobbled. They didn't hold things, they clutched. The memory of the cold stayed long after the snow had melted. A ghost in the nerves, a whisper in the knuckles, a cruel teacher that never left the classroom. Fashion had to adapt, not because of style, but because people wanted to keep their ears attached. Hoods grew deeper, cloaks got thicker, gloves became little hand coffins stuffed with fur dreams and the occasional lice. Some nobles wore so many layers that they waddled like tired birds. It didn't help much, but it was something, a thin line between dignity and amputation. And people clung to it like it meant something. Medical solutions were worse than the affliction. To treat frostbite, a barber surgeon might recommend cutting off the dead parts, with a dull knife rubbing the area with snow because more cold always helps, or bleeding the patient for reasons no one understood. Some suggested warming the affected limb by plunging it into animal intestines because nothing says healing like sloshing around inside a dead pig. Survival wasn't guaranteed. Infection was likely. Shame was optional. Animals didn't get frostbite. Why? Because they weren't forced to wear poorly sewn linen and fake bravery. Pigs burrowed, sheep huddled, cats simply disappeared until spring. Meanwhile, humans trudged through frozen fields, faces red and teeth clenched, pretending that walking uphill in a blizzard was a normal Tuesday. The smarter ones copied animals, dug into hay piles, crawled into cellars, or just refused to leave the hearth. The rest froze and called it duty, and still life carried on. Weddings happened in winter, births too. Frostbitten fingers held newborns, frozen lips kissed brides. Joy danced awkwardly alongside numb limbs and missing digits. The cold didn't pause for love. It simply sat at the table and helped itself to dessert, and people learned to smile with frozen cheeks and hope the tears didn't freeze on their faces before hitting the floor. In the end, frostbite wasn't a surprise. It was an expectation. A winter tradition passed from generation to generation. Children were taught early to hide their hands, double their socks, and never touch metal with bare skin. Stories were told about old Margaret, who lost both ears and still knitted scarves. Or Black-Toe John, who taught his grandchildren to kick with the other foot. These weren't cautionary tales, they were family history. So if you think your heating bill is high, remember this: once upon a time warmth was a rumour, and fingers were optional. Comfort wasn't an entitlement, it was a gamble, and frostbite wasn't a rare medical condition. It was your family crest etched in flesh, proudly displayed on every limp, every stiff knuckle, every laugh that ended in a wince. A reminder that the castle didn't care if you were noble or nameless. The cold came for everyone, equally, enthusiastically, and often. From a distance, moats were picturesque. They circled castles like watery necklaces glistening under the sun, as if some medieval architect had prioritised aesthetics over practicality. But up close, where the water stank, the mud clung, and the ducks eyed you with judgment, moats were less fairy tale nor sewage pit with a moat-shaped marketing team. They were not crystal-clear canals. They were defensive ditches full of regret leeches and the decomposing ambitions of invaders past. Romanticised by painters and poets, moats in reality were nature's insult wrapped in a defensive strategy. Moats were dug not for beauty, but because someone had to make sure enemies couldn't just walk into the castle like they were delivering bread. The idea was simple: dig a trench, fill it with water, and hope it discouraged people with swords from visiting. But in doing so, medieval engineers accidentally created a stagnant mosquito-infested soup bowl that doubled as a moat and a health hazard. There was no filtration, no tidy landscaping, just sludgy water that smelled like wet dog and medieval sin. Some moats were dry, which sounds better until you realise dry moat is just a fancy term for death pit lined with thorns and disappointment. Others were filled with brackish standing water that turned into slush in the winter and bubbling stew in the summer. People dumped chamber pots into them. Animals fell in and were never seen again, and children were warned to stay away unless they wanted to become ghost stories with very specific locations. The only creatures that thrived in moats were frogs, lice, and the occasional corpse. You might imagine drawing water from a moat in desperate times. You shouldn't. People tried. They died, or at the very least vomited for a week, and developed the kind of cough that medieval doctors chalked up to bad humours before bleeding you with a leech. Drinking from the moat was a cry for help. It meant you were past hope, past logic, and teetering on the edge of just let the castle fall. Boiling the water didn't help. The stench alone could knock out a night. And speaking of nights, moats were their nemesis. Shiny armour plus slippery embankments equals one wet, rattling embarrassment. Charging a castle looked noble in tapestries, but reality meant horses balking at the edge of a pit filled with frogs and disease, and soldiers hesitating as they realised that the plank bridge was covered in butter and bad luck. Some brave souls tried swimming across only to discover that their chainmail worked better as a diving weight. Entire attacks stalled because nobody wanted to ruin their boots. Inside the castle, the moat was a double-edged misery. It was supposed to keep people out, but it also kept bad smells in. The moist air crept in through gaps in the stone, carrying hints of mildew algae and rotting things nobody had seen in months. Mould grew with enthusiasm. Lower chambers stank constantly, and servants slept beside the moat wall, developed a permanent sniffle that no priest nor poultice could fix. The moat didn't just guard the castle, it colonised it. Of course the castle lord didn't care. He lived upstairs above the stink line in rooms perfumed with imported herbs and scented candles made from beeswax and self-delusion. The people who had to clean near the moat or heaven forbid dredge it were peasants, usually bribed with bread and a very loose promise of not dying today. They used long poles to fish out debris dead birds and occasionally the remnants of failed suitors or thieves. The work was thankless and damp. Always, always damp. Moats in winter became ice traps. They looked solid, inviting children and guards alike to step out and enjoy a frozen shortcut. But ice over a medieval moat was thin, deceptive, and filled with betrayal. One step too far and you'd crash through into water that hadn't seen the sun since August. If you didn't drown, you'd freeze. If you didn't freeze, you'd catch a fever. If you didn't catch a fever, congratulations, you now had moat fungus on your leg. It never left. Sometimes castle defenders used the moat as a weapon. If attackers managed to bridge it, boiling oil or rocks were hurled from above, sending them flailing into the mire. The idea of drowning while simultaneously being stoned by a teenager with a bucket of gravel was not possible. It was humiliating. Stories were told of entire battalions reduced to scrambling in knee-high sludge while villagers watched and cheered. There were no heroes in the moat, just victims and mistakes. And then came the animals. People imagined crocodiles. That's charming. There were no crocodiles. There were rats the size of guilt and geese with vendettas. Sometimes fish lived in the moat, usually blind, usually angry. Ducks nested, laid eggs and launched surprise attacks. Dogs fell in and came out smelling like despair. Once in a while, swans moved in, and suddenly the moat was a no-go zone because no one messes with a medieval swan. They were the nobles of birds and the tyrants of water. In summer the moat bloomed literally. Algae spread like gossip. The surface turned green, then brown, then grey. Bubbles appeared filled with secrets and bacteria. Dragonflies skimmed the surface, unaware they hovered over medieval soup. It was technically alive, but also deeply wrong. If the wind blew just right, the entire courtyard reeked. Gardens wilted near it. Scribes writing poetry by the window gagged mid-sonnet. Romance stood no chance within 50 feet of moat stench. When it rained, the moat flooded. Overflow seeped into the castle foundations, turning basements into aquariums. Rats paddled through grain stores. Furniture floated. Nobles panicked. Servants were blamed. Nobody thought to improve drainage because God willed it. And the moat keeps out the bad people. Except now the bad people were just damp and standing ankle deep in someone's pantry. The moat took no sides. It attacked friend and foe alike in equal parts rot and surprise. Over time, some castles filled in their moats. They realised that a glorified ditch full of infectious water and grumpy geese wasn't worth the maintenance. They planted gardens over it, built walls instead, or just pretended it was never there and hoped no one remembered the frog incident of 1387. But in the hearts of those who lived through it, the moat remained an eternal, smelly trench of regret and mildew. The castle might have looked grand, but beneath it flowed a ring of liquid betrayal. In stories, moats shimmer. In reality, they squelched. They gurgled. They whispered things no water should whisper. They stained shoes, claimed pets, and gave birth to legends involving mouldy boots and mysterious illnesses. They were neither lake nor stream, just liquid punishment shaped like a circle. And while they may have stopped a few armies, they mostly just made life wetter and slightly more miserable for the people already suffering inside the stone walls. So the next time you dream of a medieval castle complete with a charming little moat, pause for a moment. Imagine the stench. Picture the frogs, the rats, the muddy banks, and the permanent damp behind your knees. Hear the splash of another boot slipping into history. Moats weren't symbols of majesty. They were the castle's apology to the surrounding countryside, a wet reminder that glory comes with mildew and a slight itch that never goes away. Medieval hospitality is often painted as charming. A warm hearth, a wooden table set with bread and cheese, a smiling host raising a pewter mug in welcome. In reality, a visit to a medieval castle was less like checking into a quaint countryside inn, and more like signing up for an endurance trial with optional dysentery. Guests were not pampered, they were subjected. The minute you stepped across the threshold, the castle began trying to kill you in small, deliberate ways. First there was the journey itself. Roads were either rivers of mud or bone-dry ruts that shattered wheels and patience. You arrived not in a carriage, but on a horse covered in cold sweat, horsehair, and a thick coating of disappointment. Your boots were soaked. Your knees ached. And as the castle loomed ahead, it didn't look inviting. It looked like a fortress preparing to test your commitment to friendship. You knocked on the great wooden door, hoping for warmth and stew. Instead, you got a servant with a sneer and a torch that barely illuminated the next series of misfortunes. Guest quarters, if they existed, were small windowless stone closets with a cot that dreamed of being straw but had long since given up. There were no fires waiting, no soft blankets, just a single candle and a jug of water so cold it had considered becoming ice. The air smelled faintly of mould and regret. If you were lucky, a servant handed you a woolen sack they called a coverlet. If you were unlucky, they forgot you entirely, and you spent the night curled in your cloak questioning your life choices and the nature of medieval friendship. Dinner was a public spectacle. Guests were seated based on importance, which meant if you were a second cousin, or some baron from the wrong side of the river, you were positioned near the door where draughts howled like disappointed ancestors, and food arrived cold and judgmental. The meal itself was often stew, which was code for things that used to be animals now floating in a sauce of unknown origin. Bread was stale, wine was warm, and utensils were mostly fingers. You smiled because that's what guests did, and you chewed carefully, hoping not to crack a molar on a gristle surprise. And then came the entertainment. Perhaps a bard, more likely a local child, forced to play the lute with one string missing. The room was loud, but not cheerful, smoky, but not warm. Your host laughed, a little too loudly explained jokes that were never funny, and recounted hunting stories where the boar always died, but somehow so did 3 servants. If you tried to excuse yourself early, you were met with side eyes and muttered comments about soft southern manners. You stayed, you suffered, and you pretended to love it because the alternative was sleeping outside with the pigs. Toilets, of course, were an adventure. If you didn't know where to look, you might ask and immediately regret it. The guard pointed you toward a stone corridor that led into darkness, where a wooden plank waited over the abyss of a cold wind and centuries of echoes. That was the guest latrine, which was really just a polite term for hole above moat. You clutched the wall for balance, you prayed, and you tried not to think about what happened if the plank snapped. Medieval visiting was not for the faint of bladder. Bathing was out of the question. The castle had one bath used by the lord on feast days, and left to gather dust and spiders the rest of the year. Guests were expected to remain politely unwashed. You could rinse your face in the basin by the door if you were brave, but the water was barely liquid and possibly alive. The towel was shared fraying and smelled like ambition gone sour. No one commented on the smell because everyone reeked. This was not a place for freshness. It was a place for endurance and nose blindness. Conversations with other guests were landmines wrapped in niceties. Everyone had alliances. Everyone was testing you. Say too much about a border dispute and you might wake up to find your horse missing. Mention the king, and suddenly half the room tensed like dogs hearing thunder. You smiled. You nodded. You drank wine like it was courage and hoped the person beside you wasn't about to duel you over a sheep grazing incident from 3 years ago. Friendships were temporary, insults were eternal, and then came the cold. At night the castle changed. The fire died. The stone walls breathed frost. You lay on your cot teeth, chattering limbs drawn in, listening to the wind howl through cracks like the screams of the uninvited dead. The blanket was a lie. The walls did not insulate, they magnified the chill. Every hour felt longer than the last, and as you lay there trying to sleep in a wool tunic and 3 layers of regret, you swore you'd never visit again. Not unless someone died, and even then only if they promised a heated chapel. Morning offered no relief. You were woken before dawn by a servant who looked like he'd just emerged from the crypt. Breakfast was a piece of bread so hard you could use it as a weapon, and a cup of ale that tasted like someone's bad decisions. No eggs, no porridge. Just cold stares and the faint hope of leaving before your soul detached from your body. If you were lucky, your host saw you off with a nod. If not, you had to navigate the exit yourself, avoiding geese mud and the pit where they dumped the kitchen water. Some castles made a show of generosity. They give you a token, a ring, a ribbon, a small carved object to remember them by. What you really remembered was the smell, the chill, and the certainty that medieval visiting was less about bonding and more about testing your will to live. The gift went in your pouch. The trauma lived forever. You mounted your horse sore in places you didn't know, could ache, and vowed to decline the next invitation no matter how noble the seal. So when modern people imagine visiting a medieval castle and picture elegance, roaring fireplaces and gentle conversation, they're picturing a fantasy invented by people who've never eaten stew by torchlight while trying not to freeze to death in a chair made of splinters. Real medieval visiting was a survival sport wrapped in etiquette. You didn't come for fun. You came because obligation demanded it, and leaving was an act of mercy from the gods of social convention. And worst of all, after you returned home cold, bruised, and possibly infected, you had to send a letter of thanks. You had to wax poetic about the hospitality, the fine company, the delightful ambience. You wrote about the laughter and joy skipping the part where you nearly froze to death in the hallway waiting for someone to unlock your door. You signed it with a flourish, sealed it with a crest, and swore under your breath never to return. And then the next winter, the invitation came again. Because in the medieval world, being a guest didn't mean being special. It meant surviving someone else's drafty misery box while pretending to enjoy it. It meant eating stew with a smile, sleeping with rats in the walls, and bathing in your own sweat for 3 days straight. It meant learning the dance of politics, chamber pots, and frostbite. Visiting a medieval castle wasn't hospitality. It was a polite form of suffering dressed in wool and candlelight. The word party conjures images of joy-light laughter, perhaps a roaring fire, people swaying to music with mugs in hand. But in a medieval castle, a party wasn't warmth and merriment. It was obligation. It was performance. It was a gathering of shivering humans pretending to be comfortable, while trying to ignore the fact that their toes were going numb and the goose on the table might have been cooked last week. Castle parties were planned like campaigns. The Lord announced the occasion a feast for a wedding, a birthday, a treaty, or sometimes simply because the rats in the pantry had not yet staged a rebellion. Preparations began weeks in advance. Chickens were caught. Barrels of ale were rolled in. A pig was slaughtered with the solemnity of a royal execution. The great hall was swept. This didn't mean it was clean, only that the larger bones and ash piles were pushed to the corners, and still, when the guests arrived, the cold was already waiting. The stone floor might have been laid in ice. 100 candles did nothing against the chill that seeped down from the high ceilings and crept up through the soles of your shoes. You stood in your best tunic, lined with the finest wool your rank could afford, and immediately regretted not wearing your undershirt, the one that smelled a little like goat, but kept your ribs from rattling. The fires roared in the hearths, but only the top 3 people in the room, the Lord, his wife, and the one guy who brought musicians, got to sit close enough to feel it. The seating was arranged in strict hierarchy. High table at the front with the noble family perched like shivering statues, back straight, eyes forward, plates full. Below them, In descending order of importance clustered the lesser lords, barons, knights, favoured merchants, lesser merchants, and finally those invited out of political necessity. That meant you probably seated near the outer wall where the temperature could only be described as punishment from the gods. You tried to smile and nod while discreetly pulling your cloak tighter and wondering how many minutes until your teeth stopped working. The food, when it arrived, came in fanfare and smoke. Platters of roasted fowl trenchers filled with mystery stew loaves of bread so tough they might have doubled as shields. You reached for a slice and found it lukewarm, as if the cook had begun heating it yesterday and given up halfway through. Meat was plentiful, sure, but chewing it was a full-time job, and more than one guest left the party with a toothache as a souvenir. Wine flowed freely, mostly because it dulled the senses and made the room feel less like a dungeon dressed in banners. Music played, though it didn't so much float through the hall as fight its way against the background roar of coughing cutlery and complaints. A bard strummed an instrument strung together with gut and optimism. The melodies were less about entertainment and more about tradition. You clapped when expected, even if you couldn't feel your fingers. Some brave souls danced, stomping stiffly on the icy floor with all the grace of drunken cattle, partly for festivity and partly to restore circulation to their legs. There were toasts, so many toasts. One for the king, one for the land, one for the sheep who hadn't frozen to death that week. Each toast was an opportunity to drink, which meant each toast was also a moment to forget that you were slowly turning into a decorative icicle. People shouted huzzah with increasing desperation. By the 6th toast, someone was under the table. By the 10th half, the room was cheering for reasons they could no longer articulate. It was warmth by illusion. If we cheer loud enough, maybe our feet won't die. Servants bustled constantly, their faces pale from years spent in the castle's circulatory system of misery. They carried trays, jugs, and platters with the resigned grace of people who understood that the guests would never notice them until something went wrong. And something always did. The roast was undercooked, the wine ran dry, a hound stole a leg of lamb, or someone mistook the chamber pot for a punch bowl. These moments became the highlights of the night. Anything that distracted from the frostbite was welcome. Midway through the party, someone would always propose a game, not a merry one. A brutal medieval test of strength, wits, or endurance. Perhaps a riddle contest where the loser had to sit in the snow for 5 minutes. Perhaps a mock duel with blunted swords that somehow still cracked ribs. Or perhaps a storytelling circle where the goal was to outwit the person before you. These weren't games, they were distractions from the cold. And if you lost, you learned very quickly that your dignity was not nearly as important as staying near the fire. The illusion of warmth peaked at midnight. That was when the last log on the fire cracked, when the wine reached its final drop, when the stew congealed into history. But no one wanted to be the first to leave. That was bad form. So guests lingered, laughing louder, talking faster, huddling closer to the fire or to each other, pretending their shivers were from excitement rather than impending hypothermia. The room pulsed with denial, a celebration built on the brittle bones of frost. When at last you stumbled to your assigned room, escorted by a half-asleep servant and a candle that spat more smoke than light, the party's illusion shattered. You arrived not to comfort, but to a small room that smelled of old boots and older secrets. The bed was a board with cloth on it. The chamber pot had frozen. The walls sweated cold. You lay down wrapped in every layer you'd brought and dreamt of bonfires you'd never known. The party was over. The suffering remained. The next morning the castle buzzed with tales. Who had danced with whom? Who had drunk too much and tried to climb the tapestry? Who had passed out into the gravy? These were the social currencies of the time stories to be traded at the next miserable gathering. But the laughter was tight, the smiles thin. No one mentioned how their feet still hadn't thawed, or how they hadn't slept for fear of freezing mid-slumber. That would break the code. The unspoken agreement that castle parties were fun, And so they repeated, year after year, feast after feast, the same frozen floors, the same stubborn fires, the same illusions stitched together by tradition and pride. Because in the medieval mind, comfort was not expected. It was conquered. You didn't attend to enjoy, you attended to endure. And if you endured well enough, maybe someone would say you looked noble while doing it. That was worth the frostbite. That was worth the hangover. That was the cost of joy in stone halls built to impress and to chill. So yes, there were parties, and yes, they were grand on the surface, but behind every smile was a clenched jaw. Behind every cheer was a prayer for warmth. Castle parties weren't warmth. They were a cold dressed in finery, a frost masked with banners, a chill hidden behind ritual. And yet somehow that illusion endured for centuries. Because in a world where survival was victory, even pretending to be warm was worth celebrating. Winter didn't ask for permission. It arrived like a monarch you didn't vote for and couldn't escape. There was no calling in sick, no hibernating under furs with a mug of something warm. The fields were empty, the skies grey, the wind sharp as betrayal, and still you worked. Because hunger was colder than snow, and starvation didn't take snow days. The medieval world didn't stop spinning just because the rivers froze. In fact, the cold only made the spinning louder. Firewood had to be chopped even if your fingers cracked open like overripe fruit with every swing. If the woodpile wasn't big enough, the hearth would go dark, and once that happened, you had about 6 hours before the inside of your home began to resemble a tomb. So you swung the axe again and again while your nose leaked and your boots filled with snow. You didn't remember stepping in. If you were a woman, winter didn't mean rest. It meant weaving faster, mending faster, cooking slower because the fire wouldn't catch. It meant hauling water from a stream that had frozen over, hacking a hole in the ice, just to fill a pail you could barely carry. And if your hands turned blue in the process, well, that was just the season's tax. Children still needed to be clothed, and food still needed to be scraped together from the same pantry that looked like it had been robbed by ghosts. Animals had to be tended, which meant trudging through snowdrifts that reached your knees just to reach the barn. Once there, the smell hit you like a blessing. Yes, it was manure, but it was warm manure. The cows breathed steam. The chickens clucked like they hated everything but they were alive, and that meant eggs. You broke the ice in their troughs, spread what little feed you had left, and prayed to whatever saint oversaw livestock that no one died before spring. Outdoor work in winter was a slow, brutal negotiation between necessity and pain. Fences still broke. Roofs still sagged. Paths still had to be cleared unless you liked the idea of your neighbour vanishing into a snowbank forever. Sometimes you hauled hay. Sometimes you shoveled snow from a cart so the wheels could move. Sometimes you simply stared at a stone wall for a moment too long, thinking about how even the wall looked like it was warmer than you. But the worst kind of winter work was hauling water. You had to carry it for cooking, for washing, which no one wanted to do, but sometimes still had to, and for the livestock. If the well was inside the village, you counted yourself lucky. If not, you prayed the ice didn't snap your bucket in two before you got back. Water sloshed out and froze on your boots. Your hands burned like they were being punished for something, and still you did it again tomorrow. If you were a child, you didn't get to play in the snow like some fairy tale. You got to sweep, to haul firewood, to hold things in place while your father hammered them with frozen fingers. Some children died doing winter work. Others just grew up angry at winter. They learned early that the only game being played was survival, and the prize was another year of getting to do it all again. Every task took longer in the cold. Your breath fogged your vision. Your fingers refused to cooperate. Ropes snapped. Tools slipped. Cuts didn't bleed properly, they just oozed slowly while your body tried to figure out if it still had enough heat to clot. By midday, the sun was already packing up for the night, and when the wind picked up, you questioned whether you'd been born into the wrong climate or the wrong species. Even inside winter didn't let you rest. Ash had to be cleared from the hearth. Rats grew bold, seeking warmth just like you. Clothes froze if you got too close to the wall while sleeping. Bread hardened into bricks. Soup had to be eaten fast or risk becoming sculpture. You cleaned, stitched, repaired, cursed, boiled, stirred, rubbed your hands together until they sparked like kindling, and still the chill pressed in, whispering that you hadn't done enough. There were no weekends in the medieval calendar, no mental health days, no stay inside and read moments. If you were a servant in a castle, winter meant hauling logs up staircases that seemed to breed steps. If you were a farmer, it meant checking your stored crops every night for mould rats or frostbite. If you were a monk, you copied texts while your ink froze mid-letter. Everyone worked. Everyone shivered. Everyone pretended the cold wasn't winning, even as their joints begged for mercy. Winter was the season that punished the poor and taunted the rich. Lords had bigger fires, sure, but also bigger halls that refused to hold warmth. They had more blankets, but also more mouths to feed. Their livestock still died. Their walls still cracked. Their servants still slipped on stairs and broke things, bones, jars, spirits. And when a pipe burst, or a frost crept into the chapel, the cold didn't care who prayed in Latin and who muttered curses in old dialects. You might think death was the ultimate punishment, but winter offered worse, the long, slow erosion of dignity. Watching your parents cry because the bread was gone. Listening to your spouse cough and knowing there was no herb left to help. Feeling your own teeth loosen from the cold and knowing they wouldn't grow back. Winter didn't kill you quickly. It wore you down inch by inch, flake by flake, until you couldn't remember what warmth had felt like. And yet people adapted. They worked together. They rotated shifts around the fire. They taught each other tricks, stuffing moss into boots, boiling pebbles for warmth, telling stories just to keep talking because silence invited frost. Grandparents passed down advice wrapped in riddles. Children learned how to carry 2 pails without spilling. Even the dogs learned to sleep closer. Survival became a choreography, each movement rehearsed through centuries of pain and persistence. There were good days, too strange as it sounds. Days when the sun cracked the ice and birds called again. Days when the bread rose like it remembered how. Days when someone shared a bit of meat or a travelling tinker stopped by, with stories and copper pans. These were tiny miracles, and they were enough. Not to make winter pleasant, but to make it survivable. Hope was never loud in winter. It was a whisper, a shared look, a fire that stayed lit all night. And in the end, winter work was not about finishing tasks. It was about continuing. Chopping wood not to warm the room, but to keep going. Stirring soup not to fill your belly, but to keep your hands moving. Tending animals not for the milk or eggs, but because they needed to keep going too. It was a season where the work never ended and never felt like enough, and that's why it mattered. Because continuing was the only form of rebellion winter understood. Cold was cruel, but it wasn't alone. Winter didn't just bring frost to your bones, it brought sickness to your doorstep, snuck in under the thatch and made itself at home in your lungs. Coughs turned to fevers. Cuts became infections. What started as a chill ended in a shroud. And once the village doctor said it's just the winter, you might as well start digging your own hole. Medieval cold wasn't a sterile freeze like a hospital freezer. It was a filthy, damp enclosed kind of cold, where everyone huddled together and breathed the same air for weeks. If one person coughed, everyone else caught it by the end of the week. There were no antibiotics. No understanding of germs, just a general sense that the air was bad and certain people seemed to drop dead more often in February. Imagine a one-room cottage. The fire is weak, the smoke is thick, and the door doesn't quite shut. Inside, 6 people sleep side by side under matted furs. Someone starts coughing in the night, hacking with a wet, rattling sound that echoes off the beams. In the morning they're pale. By evening they're gone. And nobody knows why, just that it wasn't God's will to save them this time. Fevers were not an event. They were a season. Children would burn with heat while the world outside stayed frozen. Sweat poured from their bodies, soaking the last good blanket. Mothers pressed their foreheads to their child's whispering prayers they barely believed anymore. They didn't need a priest to declare death. The silence at dawn did that just fine. Some people blamed the cold, others blamed the devil, but most just blamed fate because they'd run out of explanations. You could drink all the garlic wine you wanted or hang onions from the rafters, but when illness came, it came like smoke, slow choking and impossible to hold back. The old went quickly, the young suffered longer, and everyone else lived in a constant state of dread. Frostbite was obvious, but what about lung rot, or the sweating sickness, or the mysterious ague which meant anything from malaria to just not waking up one day? The names didn't matter. The result was the same aching bones, useless limbs, and a body too weak to move but too stubborn to die quickly. And worst of all, your loved ones had to watch. There were no separate sick rooms, no quarantine. The sick lay among the healthy, and the healthy slowly became the sick. If a parent fell ill, a child had to fetch water. If a child burned with fever, the family took turns spooning broth between coughs. Sometimes they recovered, sometimes they didn't. And when the last breath came, no one shouted or cried, they just folded the body quietly and made space for the next. In castles it was no better, just richer. Courtiers wore velvet, but their lungs drowned all the same. The tapestries were damp, the feast spread stomach sickness. Servants passed trays with shaking hands and collapsed in the corridor hours later. A prince and a peasant could both die from the same winter cough, just in rooms with different ceilings. Doctors did what they could, which was mostly bleed you, or boil something that smelled like despair. Sometimes they wrapped you in herbs, sometimes they stuck leeches to your feet, sometimes they just said it is in the hands of the Lord and left. There was comfort in routine, even if the routine involved letting people die with dignity instead of screaming. That at least you could control. The worst part wasn't always the death. It was the waiting. A slow unravelling of someone you loved breath by breath. A child too weak to cry. A spouse who slept all day and never woke up properly. The way the skin turned grey, the eyes went distant, and the room filled with the scent of something final. You didn't talk about it. You just opened a window and tried not to vomit, and yet people kept living. After the burial, they lit another fire. They turned the straw mattress. They scrubbed the floor with pine if they had any. And they hoped irrationally stubbornly that they would be the ones who survived this year. Not because they were better, not because they were braver, but because somebody had to. Sometimes a healer passed through a woman with a pouch of dried nettles and more knowledge than a dozen priests. She might crush garlic with honey or boil a black root in milk or make you breathe smoke from a bundle of herbs tied with thread. Some called her a witch. Others called her a last chance. When the patient improved, she was a miracle. When they died, she vanished. The church offered prayers and ashes. The healer offered warmth and willow bark. Both were unreliable, but one spoke Latin and the other used her hands. In the dead of winter, most people chose hands. They didn't want sermons. They wanted soup. They wanted a voice that didn't tremble with fear. And sometimes that was enough. Children died most in winter. The frost didn't care about innocence, and the wind made no exception for tiny lungs. A child would cough through the night and go silent by morning. Parents didn't talk about it afterward. Grief was private, death was expected, love was expressed through extra layers and stronger broth, not words. And yet life still flickered. One baby would die, another would be born the next week. The midwife would nod, the fire would crackle, and someone would start boiling cloth again. Death was part of winter's rhythm, like chopping wood or milking cows. You learned not to flinch when it passed your door. Just nod politely and keep moving. Some winters were worse than others. Entire villages lost half their people. Sometimes the burial ground froze so hard you couldn't dig. The bodies waited in barns stacked with hay to keep the animals from chewing. Dogs howled at night. The smoke from chimneys became fewer and fewer. And then spring came, and you pretended you didn't remember. Cold didn't kill you outright. Disease finished the job. It used the cold as a doorway, the draughts as its servants, the coughing neighbour as its messenger. It danced from lung to lung, kissed foreheads, sat by bedsides. And when it left, it didn't slam the door. It just slipped away into the frost, waiting for next year. But the medieval soul was stubborn. It prayed brood-stitched and shovelled through the pain. It washed its hands in snow-wrapped wounds, in wool told stories to the sick. It believed in warmth even when none was coming. It stayed up with the dying so they wouldn't be alone. That too was medicine. Winter was a season of death, but it was also a season of defiance. Every act of care, every bowl of stew, every extra log on the fire said not today. Disease might come, cold might howl. But the human spirit, even trembling, coughing, frostbitten, kept showing up. And sometimes that was enough to outlast the winter. We like to imagine that if you were a noble in a medieval castle, you somehow escaped the great icy grip that clutched the rest of society. Rich people don't get cold, right? They had fires, they had furs, they had feather beds and servants to warm their boots before breakfast. But that is a modern delusion born from watching too many costume dramas where the fire roars on cue and no one's nose ever turns blue. In truth, the noble life was just as cold, only dressed up in velvet and denial. The grand halls were built for status, not comfort. Giant ceilings and stone walls looked impressive, but they turned every room into a wind tunnel. Tapestries couldn't stop the drafts. Rugs didn't warm the floors. The moment the fire in the great hearth died down, and it always did, you were left clutching your goblet like a hot water bottle, teeth chattering beneath layers of brocade. A castle was a monument to power, not insulation. Even the nobles didn't sit around all day sipping wine in warm nooks. They had ceremonies, feasts, and endless obligations that required them to dress in stiff decorative clothes and walk through frigid corridors pretending not to notice the frost forming on the inside of the window glass. A noblewoman in winter might wear 5 skirts and a fur-lined cloak and still feel the icy touch of air snake up her spine. A nobleman's beard might glisten not with wealth, but with condensation from his own breath. And don't be fooled by the canopies over the beds. Yes, the 4-posters were draped in thick fabric. Yes, there were feather mattresses and fur throws, but those beds were inside rooms so large and cold that you could see your breath in the moonlight. The canopy wasn't luxury, it was survival, an attempt to trap body heat before it floated up to the rafters. Often nobles slept in pairs not just for affection or politics, but because another warm body was the only source of heat that didn't require chopping wood. Servants were expected to stoke the fires, but even they couldn't keep up with the endless battle against cold stone. A fire might be roaring when you entered your chamber, but within an hour it had shrunk to embers, and not every room had a hearth. Some noble families only heated select rooms, usually the solar or great hall, leaving the rest to embrace the glacial aesthetic of a crypt. Moving from one room to another was less a walk and more a bracing sprint through an icebox. Food wasn't spared either. A banquet looked splendid. Roasted swans, jellied fish, golden pies. But the moment the platters hit the table, the chill began its work. By the time a noble forked a bite to their lips, the dish was lukewarm at best. Cooks worked in infernal kitchens only for their masterpieces to cool into mediocrity before the first toast. Nobles might dine with elegance, but they did it wrapped in layers, hands cold under jewel-covered rings. And what of the children? Little lords and ladies were dressed like miniature adults in silk and velvet and fur-lined cloaks, but they were still children, still small bodies trying to generate enough warmth to fight off the freeze. Nannies bundled them in layers, but at night when the fire died and the castle fell silent, the cold crept in. Bed sheets froze, little toes went numb, and a cough in winter was never just a cough. It was the beginning of a silent worry that travelled from cradle to cradle. Bathing didn't become easier just because you had a title. If anything, it was a more elaborate disaster. A noble bath required servants to haul hot water, fill a wooden tub, and add herbs or oils to mask the scent of mildew. The moment the water cooled, the whole event turned into a luxurious shiverfest. One could sit in scented misery, teeth chattering, trying to enjoy the sensation of freezing in perfumed broth. Nobility may have looked clean, but it didn't mean they were warm. Hunting was a noble pastime, and winter was no excuse to stop. Lords rode out with hawks and hounds, cheeks stinging from wind breath, fogging like dragons. They gripped frozen reins, wore furs lined with more furs, and pretended that stalking deer in a snow-laced forest was enjoyable. Meanwhile, squires trudged behind with numb fingers, wondering if chivalry could warm toes. It couldn't. But honour apparently required frostbite. Even the royal courts were chilled with more than just politics. Great halls used for audiences and courtly dance were vast, echoing, and icy. Everyone dressed magnificently. Long sleeves, heavy trains, ornate collars, but beneath the pageantry, everyone was shivering. Nobles stood tall with stiff backs, not out of pride, but because to slouch would let the cold creep down between shoulder blades. Appearances mattered more than body heat, and so everyone froze beautifully. Letters written during medieval winters often complained of the cold not just from peasants, but from barons, bishops, and queens. One duchess described the frost forming on her cup of wine between sips. A bishop wrote of ink freezing in its well. A king noted that he slept with his hunting dogs in the chamber, not for affection, but for warmth. Even the crown didn't stop the cold from biting. It just made you look regal while it did. There were attempts at comfort. Nobles used warming pans, metal dishes filled with hot coals to heat beds. They wrapped bricks in cloth and placed them beneath their feet. They burned candles for light and illusionary warmth. But these were all flickers against a vast stone-cold reality. The fire burned bright in legend, but in truth it smoked more than it heated. And once it died, the velvet became just as useless as homespun wool. Music was one of the few ways to feel alive in the cold. Minstrels played, lutes rang, and voices sang under ceilings that echoed with chill. Dancing, too, became a survival tactic: get moving or grow stiff. A winter celebration was less about joy and more about inertia. If you could keep the blood flowing, you might make it through the night. If not, there was always mulled wine to soften the edges. Some nobles fled the cold by travelling south to warmer lands or lowland estates. But even then, travel meant days in freezing carriages or on horseback, wrapped in furs and praying the snow didn't cave in the roads. Nobles might flee one freeze only to be ambushed by another. There were no real warm refuges, just warmer comparisons, and for most flight wasn't an option. Status looked impressive from the outside, but castles were cages with better cutlery. It's tempting to think that nobles were insulated from the suffering of winter, but insulation was a fantasy, not a fact. They had status, yes. Power, yes. But warmth. That was a resource as scarce for them as for the farmer in the fields. The cold didn't care about lineage. It crept through mortar and slithered beneath silk. It humbled everyone eventually. The noble life was painted in gold leaf, but gold doesn't hold heat. Beneath the glamour was a daily grind of fending off frost with ceremony and stubbornness. Blankets were woven thicker, yes, but misery still got in. The laughter at feasts had an edge of desperation. The robes were stitched with fear. And when the fire died at midnight, every title, every crown, every scroll of land meant nothing to the ice settling in their bones. In the end, the noble life was still a life in winter, just colder, with slightly better furniture. Medieval architecture was magnificent, yes, but only if you weren't forced to live inside it. From the outside, castles rose like solemn monuments to stone and power, majestic silhouettes against bleak skies. But from the inside, they were misery turned to mortar. If you've ever admired a castle from afar and thought, I wish I lived there, allow yourself this clarification: you do not. Living inside one was less like living in a home, and more like surviving in a very elaborate dungeon with slightly better food. The walls were thick, not for comfort, but for war. A 6-foot wall might stop an arrow, but it would not stop the cold. Heat had nowhere to go but up, which it did, immediately abandoning the miserable humans on the ground. There was no insulation, no cosy padding between you and the outside. The stone drank up the fire's warmth like a miser and never gave it back. You could press your hand to the wall and feel it judging you for your foolishness. Windows, if they existed at all, were narrow and placed high. That wasn't an aesthetic decision, it was military logic. Small openings meant fewer spots for arrows to fly in or invaders to climb through. But it also meant almost no natural light and certainly no view. A sunny corner was less a location, and more a fantasy whispered about in candlelit despair. Glass was a luxury reserved for chapels and kings, and even then it was so thick and wavy, it might as well have been decorative fog. Staircases spiraled clockwise, not because it looked cool, but because they were designed for right-handed defenders to have the advantage against intruders. Great if you're fighting a siege, less great if you're trying to carry a bucket of water without falling to your death. The stairs were steep, uneven, and built into cramped shafts that funneled cold air straight down your neck. Every trip up or down became a meditative practice in balance and suppressed profanity. Safety wasn't in the blueprint, murder and misery were. Ceilings were high for smoke clearance, not grandeur. The fireplaces, when they existed, puffed out more smoke than heat, and the ceilings caught it like soot-stained traps. You might warm your hands by the fire, but your head was still in a cloud of wood smoke. And let's not forget, the higher the ceiling, the harder it was to heat the room. Most of the warmth gathered 20 feet above your frozen body, mocking you from a height you couldn't reach unless you happened to be a ghost. Doors were equally malicious. Most weren't shaped for comfort, they were sized for defense livestock control or dramatic reveals. They swelled with damp stuck during frost and groaned like haunted mouths when opened. Hinges rusted with enthusiasm, and the handles were often iron, meaning they became either scalding or skin-peeling cold depending on the season. A good door was one that didn't bite back, and many of them, to the horror of numb fingers, required keys the size of a child's arm. Roofs were masterpieces of misery. Thatched, tiled, or shingled, they all had one common trait: leakage. Rain seeped through in strategic drips that relocated nightly. Snow piled on top and slowly melted through. Birds nested in the eaves, and bats sometimes joined the party. Repairing them required climbing atop windswept peaks of stone and praying to survive the journey. Architects didn't design them to protect you. They designed them to endure until you died, and someone else inherited the problem. The layout of medieval buildings was driven by hierarchy, not logic. Kitchens were placed far from dining halls to reduce fire risk, but that also meant food arrived lukewarm at best. Latrines were often located outside or across drafty corridors, because smell was a lower priority than comfort. Bedrooms could be vast stone cubes with no direct heat source, because the master of the house preferred grandeur over lungs. You didn't live in a space optimized for you. You lived in a structure optimized for status, defense, and suffering. Chimneys, when they appeared, were a step up from central smoke holes, but not by much. Early chimneys were stone funnels that collected soot like a hobby and drew wind like a whistle. Birds nested inside, and downdrafts would occasionally blow smoke right back into the room. It was possible to be smoked out of your own chamber by your own fireplace. You coughed, your eyes watered, and still the fire crackled on cheerfully, oblivious to your suffering. Lighting was another architectural afterthought. Candles were expensive torches, smoky, and windows ineffective. So you navigated your own home by memory touch and sheer optimism. Shadows ruled the corners, and any illusion of comfort was swallowed by gloom. In some castles, entire wings were effectively abandoned in winter simply because they were too dark to inhabit. You could live there technically, just not see where you were going or who was sneaking up behind you. Ventilation was a word that didn't exist, but its absence was deeply felt. with tightly sealed doors to keep out the cold and narrow windows for defence air stagnated in most rooms. The result, smells lingered. Body odour, wet dog smoke, onions, take your pick. They hung like invisible guests at a feast. You got used to it. That was the horror, not the stench itself, but the fact that your body stopped noticing it after a while. Even religious buildings weren't exempt. Cathedrals with their awe-inspiring height and intricate stonework were architectural triumphs for the soul, but not for the body. You could sit through Mass and feel your toes slowly go numb, as Gregorian chants echoed through the chill. The stone pews offered neither comfort nor mercy. If God was in the room, he was surely wearing a cloak. Engineers, if we're being generous, knew how to keep buildings standing through war and time, but warmth comfort. They considered those luxuries for future centuries, and even then their structural genius was often turned against the people who lived within. Secret passageways were built for spying, not shortcuts. Murder holes were meant to drop rocks on intruders, but also dropped cold air onto your head. Defensive towers were built high for visibility, but you froze before you could enjoy the view. Let us not forget the cellars and storerooms, eternal realms of damp. They were crucial for food storage, but also ideal incubators for mould rats and melancholia. You went down for turnips and came back up with spiritual despair. Stone absorbed moisture like it was its purpose, and once the chill crept in, it never left. You could dry herbs in summer, but you couldn't dry your socks in January. The servants' quarters, if we can even call them that, were little more than architecturally sanctioned punishment zones. Tiny, unheated, and placed near drafty corners or above kitchens where the smoke rose but the heat didn't. They were a masterclass in forced humility. Engineers didn't design for the poor, they designed around them. If the master wanted heat, the servant got a smoke hole. If the master wanted silence, the servant got a creaking stair to nowhere. Every room echoed. That wasn't a feature, it was just the result of being surrounded by bare stone-hard floors and zero soft furnishings. Sound bounced, lingered, returned. A cough in the hall could sound like a dying animal in the chapel. You couldn't speak in private because the walls had ears, or at least excellent acoustics. Whispered secrets became hallway rumours in less than an hour. By the time you realise medieval architecture wasn't cruel by accident, it was cruel by design, it's too late. You've already frozen in the spiral stairwell, tripped over uneven flagstones and dropped your only candle in a corridor made of echo and regret. You sit in a castle, wrapped in your cloak, staring at the dancing shadows on the wall, wondering why humans thought this was progress. The answer: it wasn't. It was just stone stacked by stubbornness and fear. The castle was built to withstand invaders, yes, but not for the comfort of the people inside. And that's the punchline. You were the honoured guest of the most miserable house on earth. A house where form never followed function, unless that function was noble suffering. The dream of castle life has always been just that, a dream. To the modern imagination it conjures visions of roaring fireplaces, velvet gowns, heroic banquets and sweeping views from the battlements. But let's rewind that fantasy and play it again with reality's volume turned up. The roaring fireplace barely heats your knees while your back remains frozen. The velvet gown is itchy, heavy and crawling with lice. The sweeping views, lovely, yes, if you don't mind frostbite on your nose and the faint smell of chamber pots wafting in from below. People often say they wish they could live in a castle, but that's because they think castles were medieval mansions. In truth, they were military fortresses barely masquerading as homes. The stone was chosen not for warmth or charm, but for its ability to withstand battering rams and trebuchets. Every architectural choice prioritized survival over comfort. And survival, as we've seen, was an aggressive negotiation with cold disease and architectural indifference. Life inside a castle wasn't elegant. It was a constant series of compromises and discomforts dressed in noble titles. Your bedroom wasn't a suite. It was a draughty cell with a tapestry that whispered the wind's secrets at night. Meals were inconsistent, privacy was a myth, and winter turned every stone corridor into an ice tunnel. Even the grandeur had a price. The more impressive your castle, the more likely it was to be under siege. And during a siege, those stone walls that kept the enemy out also kept the cold and the stink firmly in. Even the highest-born noble wasn't safe from castle misery. You might have fancier furs or a dedicated servant to warm your sheets with a hot brick, but in the end you still slept with your cloak on and prayed your breath didn't frost the bed canopy. You still tiptoed to the privy and hoped no rats were nesting in the latrine chute, and you still woke up each morning hoping your toes hadn't turned black. Luxury in the castle context simply meant you suffered in a slightly bigger room. The romantic glow around castles is largely the fault of paintings, fairy tales and tourism brochures. Visit a restored castle in the summer with electric lighting, concealed heaters and a gift shop nearby, and yes, it feels magical. But remove the heating, the insulation and the glass windows, and you're back in the 1300s, shivering in a stone tomb with drafty hallways and haunted echoes. The castle didn't protect you from the elements, it trapped you in them. And if the cold didn't kill you, the boredom disease or chimney smoke probably would. Modern comfort has warped our sense of medieval resilience. We light a scented candle and call it ambiance. Medieval folk lit candles because otherwise they'd break their necks falling down unlit stairs. We wrap in a blanket for coziness. They wrapped themselves in whatever wasn't damp because hypothermia was stalking them at every corner. And we visit castles as charming relics, never considering what it truly meant to endure one night after night, frost after frost, siege after siege. Still want to live in a castle? Imagine your entire winter with no central heating, no insulation, no glass windows, no electric lights, and your only hot meal being a pot of onion broth that's cooled before you can get to it. Imagine sleeping in a room where the wind whines through the mortar and the closest toilet is across a snow-covered courtyard, past the snoring guards and the frozen dog. Imagine dressing in the dark, wearing the same wool for days, and waking up to your own breath fogging in the air still sound enchanting. Castles were incredible feats of engineering, but they weren't built with human warmth in mind. They were built for power, intimidation and endurance. And while they offered protection from arrows, they offered no such mercy from the cold, the stink, or the gnawing hunger of winter. The great halls echoed with music only during feast days. On most nights they echoed with coughing and the scraping of spoons in empty bowls. The dream of castle life fades quickly when faced with the day-to-day grind of surviving it. That said, maybe the castle fantasy still holds something real, not in the architecture, but in the human ability to adapt. People lived through these hardships with a kind of practical bravery we've mostly forgotten. They raised families, carved wood, played music, and shared stories beside low fires. They didn't need central heating to build warmth. They built it through shared lives, however short or cold those lives might have been. Maybe that's the part of the castle dream worth keeping. So if you ever find yourself wandering the quiet ruins of a medieval castle, shivering as the wind snakes through your jacket, take a moment to imagine it as it truly was, loud, smoky, cold, alive. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was survival dressed in stone. A brutal, beautiful mess of human determination pressed between the cracks of mortar and time. And while it may not have been warm, it was undeniably real.